Across the winding corridors of time, there are names that echo softly. Monarchs, sovereigns, crowned beings once believed untouchable. They ruled empires, commanded armies, sat beneath gilded ceilings, and held the fate of nations in their palms. And yet, they vanished, not in battle, not in ceremony, but in silence. This is a story, no, a long sleepwalk through the hidden chambers of history, where royal blood spilled without a sound, where footsteps stopped before the last door, where graves were never filled and names dissolved. Like mist at dawn, you may think kings and queens leave behind grand legacies, monuments, statues, inscriptions. But what happens when the only thing they leave behind is a question? Over the next few hours, we will drift slowly through 8 such mysteries. 8 rulers who walked into legend and never returned. No bodies, no answers, only shadows where their stories once stood. That we begin in the high towers of medieval England, where a boy king vanished from the tower, his crown never worn, his bones never confirmed. From there, we'll cross the blistering deserts of Persia, where a warlord emperor and his loot of fabled jewels disappeared, swallowed by history's silence. That we'll hear the stones of Constantinople whisper of an emperor who stood against fire and steel, then simply became legend. Then comes a king of Scotland seen last upon a blood-red field, his body never recovered, as if the land itself refused to yield him. That you'll meet a sultan lost to the desert, his caravan left behind like an offering to some unknowable force. That a French queen cast into shadow, shuddered from the world, until even her tomb became a rumor. The last queen of Madagascar, exiled and displayed like an artifact. Then, silence. No more letters. No more life. Just absence. And finally, a crown prince of Nepal, who became king while in a coma, before his name was scratched out with the stroke of a bullet, or perhaps the bend of a lie. Every one of them, powerful and then gone. Without explanation, without finality, only theories, whispers, and those chilling, unfinished footnotes of history. So tonight, or whenever you are listening, lean back. Let the hush of forgotten kingdoms surround you. Let the torches dim and the gates creak shut. You are about to enter a realm where thrones crumble into dust, and even kings can simply vanish. The spring of 1483 came quietly across the fields of England, brushing the land with pale light and thin winds. Lambs stirred on distant hillsides. Blossom trees opened their white arms to the sky. But in the high halls of Westminster, change did not arrive with such gentleness. The boy was 12 years old. Edward, Prince of Wales, heir to a throne held tight by blood and war. His father, King Edward IV, had ruled for over 2 decades, his reign forged through battles and betrayals, the heavy fruit of the Wars of the Roses. But kings fall, even mighty ones, and Edward IV, the lion of the Yorkist court, died in his bed on the 9th of April, 1483, quietly, suddenly. Some say from gluttony and age. Others whispered darker things. His son was proclaimed king that same day. Edward V, still only a child, thin of face, grave of eye, a boy who had been raised to rule, yes, but too young, still, to wear the crown without a hand to steady him. And so eyes turned to that hand. The boy's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Richard was a man carved from shadow. Thin, cold-eyed, limping from an old injury, he had served loyally under his brother's reign. A soldier and strategist, not often seen at court. But death rearranges everything. And in a country that remembered Civil War too well, a child king meant uncertainty. Factions stirred, loyalties twisted. What is it that power does to the soul? They say young Edward was in Ludlow when he heard of his father's death. The message came swifter than comfort. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, Queen of England, did not wait. She fled into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her younger children, perhaps fearing what would come. She had seen too much not to. But Edward, the new king, had no such escape. He was escorted toward London under the protection of his uncle Anthony Woodville, the Earl Rivers. The Woodvilles, his mother's family, were wealthy, ambitious, and widely resented among the older nobility, and they had enemies, especially in Richard. The boy's journey to London was slow and quiet, a trail of wagons, servants, and letters. But at Stony Stratford, something changed. Richard of Gloucester met them there, not alone, but with an armed escort. The day had been planned, timed, as though rehearsed. Words were exchanged behind closed doors. Accusations floated between the walls. Then, without bloodshed, Rivers and other Woodville guardians were arrested. The boy did not protest. Or if he did, no record remains. He was told his uncle would guide him now, that this was the king's wish, that all was proper. So Edward continued the journey with Richard, not knowing the last free breath of his boyhood had already passed. When he entered London, the crowds gathered to see him. A king on horseback, small, pale, dressed in fine blue. He did not smile, but he nodded. He waved. The people cheered. Some threw flowers, and some whispered that he was taken to the royal apartments in the Tower of London. It did not seem unusual at first. For centuries, kings had stayed in the tower before their coronation. It was tradition, a place of royal lodging as well as a fortress. But time has a way of turning safe places into cages and towers into tombs. The coronation was scheduled for June 22. Indeed, it never came. Days passed, then weeks. The boy remained in the tower, now joined by his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, a boy of 9. They were seen together, sometimes playing in the garden court, sometimes looking down from the windows. And then they were not seen at all. Their public appearances ceased. The coronation was postponed. Rumors thickened like smoke. What was happening inside those stone walls? Why had the royal proclamation gone quiet? On June 25th, Parliament received a document, Titulus Regius, declaring the two boys illegitimate. It claimed that their father's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid, that the crown did not belong to Edward after all, that it now belonged to his uncle, and so Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became Richard III. The people watched, confused, some fearful, some indifferent. A new king crowned, yet the old one not yet buried. The children still alive, and yet unheard from. In the long hush of that summer, the tower stood still. The boys were no longer seen. Guards changed. Servants rotated. Some said they caught glimpses of them at windows, thin and pale, dressed in white. Others said they had been moved, or ill, or gone, but no word ever came. What passed through the mind of a 12-year-old king in those stone chambers? Did Edward know the danger he was in? Did he sleep at night, holding his brother's hand, waiting for word of his coronation? Did he imagine the golden crown still waiting in Westminster Abbey? Or did he already know that the world had changed, perhaps? He asked the same question we ask now. Why? The boys vanished. There was no trial, no public announcement, no bodies, only silence. Later, years later, 2 small skeletons were found beneath a staircase in the tower, hidden in a chest of wood and stone. Were they the boys? No one knows for certain. But the story had already passed into shadow, and the whispers had taken root. They say Richard killed them, that he ordered it, quietly, efficiently, to secure his crown. Others blame the Duke of Buckingham, or Henry, Tudor, who would one day become Henry VII and who had just as much to gain from their disappearance. But the truth has never risen from the stones. Like a dream dissolved in morning mist, the boys slipped through the cracks of history, leaving behind only questions and bloodless bedsheets. Even today, you can walk the echoing halls of the Tower of London. You can follow the damp corridors, touch the moss-laced walls, stand beneath the windowless turrets where cold air lingers, and you may wonder, what did they see in their final days? What words passed between two brothers locked away in the heart of the kingdom? Did they still hope? Or had they learned too early that power does not kneel for innocence? The next part continues this journey as the shadows deepen and the truth retreats further into the cold. Summer deepened, but the tower grew colder in the city beyond its walls. The air was warm with market songs and the clatter of hooves on cobblestones. Children darted between stalls. Church bells rang in the distance. The Thames glittered. But within that ancient fortress, time lost its shape. Silence settled like dust on the stone. The two princes, Edward and Richard, had once played in the gardens there. There are accounts, faint and rare, of them laughing softly beneath the gaze of guards, of a ball rolling across the grass, of a boy with golden hair chasing his brother through the shade. But these glimpses grew few and far between, and then they stopped altogether. One day, the boys were seen. The next, they were not, and no one spoke of it aloud. Not then. Not yet. Was July now. The coronation that had once been planned for Edward had passed, cancelled without public explanation. In his place, Richard of Gloucester had been crowned King Richard III in Westminster Abbey, standing where his brother had once stood, where his nephew had once been promised to stand. He arrived in robes of deep purple, his crown rimmed with ermine and gold. Some say he wept. Some say his eyes were hard as glass. But none deny that he accepted the weight of kingship with a quiet finality, as if he had always meant to carry it. He made a vow that day. He would serve justly, he said, rule wisely. He swore to defend the realm from disorder, to protect the church and the people. And yet, on that same day, those who had known the boys best were already beginning to disappear. Anthony Woodville, their uncle, dead. Richard Grey, their half-brother, dead. Others arrested, or sent north, or vanished, like threads being pulled from a tapestry, until only one figure remained, clearly woven into the center. Richard now ruled from the very heart of a realm still wounded by war. But while the banners were raised in his honor, and the proclamations sang of his right to rule, there was a tremor beneath it all. People began to wonder, where were the boys? The streets of London did not ask it loudly, not at first. Fear clung like frost to the doorframes of the poor. But questions, unspoken, have a way of spreading. Whispers traveled on the breath of wind. Have you seen them? Did they escape? Are they being protected or silenced? The royal household said nothing. The tower kept its silence. And Richard, newly crowned, offered no reassurance, no public proof that the children were well. Instead, he toured the country, far from London, far from the tower's shadow. There are those who believe the boys were still alive, at least for a time. Some records, thin as parchment, suggest they were seen in the garden in early summer. Others claim they were moved to a different part of the tower, that they played chess in the evenings and were given books and warm food, that they lived in hope. But if they had hope, it was a fragile thing. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, remained in sanctuary, watching from afar as her sons disappeared from the tapestry of power. She must have known, in her quiet hours beneath the abbey's vaulted stone, that the tides had turned. Her allies had crumbled. Her enemies held the crown. She had once been queen, and now she waited. For what? For a sign? For news? For a miracle? What torment does a mother endure in silence? By August, the rumors had grown teeth, an Italian observer. In London, Dominic Mancini wrote of the boys' confinement. He claimed they were held in the tower, less as guests and more as prisoners. He noted how Edward, the elder brother, daily stood in the chapel, and how he seemed sorrowful beyond his years. Mancini wrote that the children were seen less and less, until finally they were not seen at all. He left England before the year ended. The princes never reappeared. In the years to come, many would seek to explain what happened. Some pointed to Richard III, their uncle, whose rise to power had been swift and suspicious. He had, after all, removed their protectors, declared their illegitimacy, and assumed the throne. Did he then go one step further? If so, how? A quiet death, perhaps. A pillow pressed against a sleeping face. A whisper in the night. Or something colder. An order given and never spoken of again. Others argued that Richard would not have risked such a sin, that the boys were instead murdered by others, perhaps the Duke of Buckingham, a former ally turned enemy, or Henry Tudor, who would later claim the throne through conquest and marriage. He had his own reasons to remove rivals. And yet, no one claimed it. No one confessed. No grave was dug in mourning. No prayers were offered publicly for the souls of the lost boys. Only silence. And the tower. What becomes of a child king lost a stone? Edward was the eldest son of a king. He had been raised in books and law, in tales of Arthur and of conquest. He had ridden horses through the green woodlands of Ludlow and listened to the whispers of ministers in velvet halls. He knew how to sign his name in royal hand. He knew how to kneel before the altar and speak of divine right. But in the tower, none of that mattered. There, he was only a boy who looked to his younger brother and said, perhaps with trembling voice, "They will come for us, won't they? Or maybe they won't hurt us. We are princes." But night makes liars of hope, and within that fortress, centuries old, with its high battlements and shadowed staircases, no sound escaped. It is said, later, that 2 guards were questioned. One claimed the boys were smothered in their sleep. Another said he helped bury them near the White Tower. Yet these testimonies came years after, spoken under threat or reward. Nothing solid, nothing provable, nothing that changed the silence. Autumn arrived, and with it, a quiet shift. People stopped asking so openly. The market sellers moved on to fresher gossip. The nobility pledged allegiance to Richard III. The court grew used to the absence of the boys. But absence is not emptiness. It lingers, like breath on glass. Years later, 2 small bodies would be found beneath a staircase during renovations. Bones of 2 boys, found in a chest. No inscriptions, no royal shroud. Were they Edward and Richard? The bones were buried in Westminster Abbey by royal command, but no full examination was permitted until centuries later. Even then, the truth remained clouded, no names etched into the stone. Only the dates guessed at, and questions left beneath the earth. But back in the year 1483, all that was still to come. In that strange and bitter summer, the tower held its silence. The wind touched its walls, and the Thames lapped quietly below. The 2 boys were gone, and the people waited, some in fear, some in denial, and some in grim acceptance. Autumn pulled its cloak across England like a closing curtain. The fields yellowed. Smoke curled from village chimneys. The warmth of summer, once soft upon the land, turned brittle and sharp. But the Tower of London remained unchanged. It had grown accustomed to silence, and silence had learned to speak in its own way. Within its thick gray walls were two princes. Had once been seen, nothing moved. No laughter echoed through the corridors. No candlelight flickered behind high windows. And yet, beyond those walls, history marched forward, dragging behind it the heavy chain of consequence. For a crown, one in shadow must answer to the light. Richard III had taken the throne. He had placed the golden circlet on his brow, and in doing so, had erased two boys from the royal line. Or so it seemed, but blood never forgets, nor does grief, and in distant halls, far from Westminster's careful pageantry, there were still those who remembered the lost children. Especially one woman who had never stopped remembering them, Elizabeth Woodville, the mother of the vanished. She remained in sanctuary, but sanctuary is not safety. It is a place of waiting. And Elizabeth had waited long enough to be why the winter of 1483, she began to move, not openly, not with swords or banners, but with letters, with alliances. She sent secret messages to another exiled noble, a man with his own claim to the throne, a man in France, a man of the House of Lancaster, Henry Tudor. Henry was no boy. He was a grown man now, 26 years old and hardened by exile. His claim to the throne was thin, passed through his mother's line. But claims grow stronger when planted in the soil of absence. The princes were gone, and if they were truly gone, there was space for another to rise. Elizabeth and Henry conspired quietly that a marriage was proposed. If Henry returned to England and seized the throne, he would marry her daughter, Elizabeth of York, the sister of the missing boys. The union would bind York and Lancaster. Two feuding roses joined into one crown. And perhaps justice, too, would be restored if the boys were dead. Henry would avenge them if alive. He would protect them. Or so the promises went. But Richard was not blind. He knew of the brewing storm. And so he tried to anchor his throne more firmly. He rewarded allies. He moved court to York. He appointed his son, another Edward, as Prince of Wales. He toured the countryside and swore to govern with justice. But even so, the air was thin around him. Rumors clung to his name like smoke on wool. Murderer, usurper, tyrant. And through it all, the ghosts of the princes hovered, not seen, not heard, but never far. In October of that year, an uprising began. The Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's staunch supporter, turned against him and led a rebellion. Historians still wonder why. Was it guilt, ambition, or some secret knowledge of what had happened to the boys? The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed, but the unrest had revealed something Richard could not ignore. The kingdom did not trust him, and the whispers had grown into questions. Even in the north, where Richard had once been loved, support grew thin. He had ruled there for years as Duke of Gloucester, a man of justice, feared but fair. But as king, he was something different. Colder, paranoid, burdened by a crown that had come at too high a price. His wife, Queen and Neville, had grown ill. His only legitimate son died suddenly in 1484. And with that loss, his line began to crumble. Who would follow him? What legacy would he leave? There were no children left to carry his name. Only the ghosts of those already lost. And then came 1485 that Henry Tudor gathered his forces. He landed at Milford Haven in Wales and marched east with a small army. The country held its breath. Nobles weighed their chances. Would they side with the king or gamble on the exile? Richard prepared for war at Bosworth Field. On August 22nd, the two men met. The sun rose over thick fog and restless horses. A hawk circled high. The fields, once home to cattle and wheat, now bristled with steel. It was a short battle, and a strange one. Many of Richard's allies failed to fight. Some betrayed him, Still, the king fought fiercely. He led a charge himself, sword drawn, his crown fastened to his helmet. But courage cannot rewrite destiny. Richard was killed in the thick of battle, struck down, abandoned, stripped, and found later beneath a heap of bodies, his skull pierced, his back gashed. He was the last English king to die in battle, and with him, the last Plantagenet. Henry Tudor was crowned on the battlefield. The red rose of Lancaster was lifted, and soon it would be joined to the white of York through marriage. The Wars of the Roses, after decades of blood, came to their end in that union. But peace is not the same as closure. And as the new king ruled, one question remained, unshaken and unanswered. What happened to the princes in the tower? Henry VII had much to gain by solving the mystery. If Richard had killed the boys, Henry's reign could be sanctified as a triumph of justice. But no official statement was ever made. No investigation. No proclamation of guilt. Why? Some suspect that Henry feared what an inquiry might reveal. What if the boys had lived? What if they had been quietly killed after Richard's death by those loyal to the new regime? Or perhaps Henry wished the past to remain buried, so that his rule might not be stained with more blood. And so, the silence continued, different. Crown. Same hush, but silence is never permanent. In 1491, 6 years after Henry took the throne, a boy appeared, a boy who claimed to be Prince Richard, the younger of the two lost brothers, that he said he had escaped the tower, that he said he had been hidden across Europe. He said he was ready to claim his crown. His name was Perkin Warbeck. Or so history records him. He was charismatic, educated, polished. He bore a striking resemblance to the royal family, and he found powerful supporters in Burgundy, in Ireland, even at the courts of Scotland and France. Could he have been telling the truth? Could a boy forgotten by history return from the grave of politics? Henry thought it possible, at least at first. He treated Warbeck as a threat, pursued him, captured him, questioned him. Eventually, Warbeck confessed. He said he was a fraud, a pretender, the son of a Flemish merchant. But then, he recanted, said his confession had been forced. He claimed again to be the true prince, that he was imprisoned in the tower. Yes, the same tower, and later executed. And with him, any flicker of hope that the princes had lived was finally extinguished. Still doubts remain. The bones found beneath the staircase in 1674, believed to be those of the two boys, were never conclusively identified. Not then. Not now. In 1933, the bones were examined briefly. They were said to match the age of the princes. But no modern analysis, no DNA testing, has ever been allowed by royal decree. And so the truth remains locked away. In stone. In soil. In silence. Centuries pass, kings rise, empires fall, but the story of the vanished princes still lingers, like breath caught between dream and waking. Not just for the tragedy it contains, but for the questions it refuses to answer. In the quiet hours before dawn, the Tower of London sits like an ancient sentinel over the slow-winding Thames. Its stones are cold to the touch. Its halls, emptied of kings and guards, remember everything. And still, nothing. No one has come forward with truth. No letter has been found. No candle burns in remembrance. Only the story remains. Edward V had once been king. Briefly, 12 years old, the son of a conqueror, the hope of a fragile dynasty. Yet, his reign was never crowned, and his fate never declared. A child, lost in the machinery of power. His brother, Richard, just 9, followed him into obscurity. The younger son, the quieter one, smaller, more playful, still holding on to the wonder of a world not yet turned cruel. Did they share dreams, huddled in the dark? Did they whisper plans to run away? If only someone would unlock the door? Did they know how close death stood? We will never know. Generations passed. New monarchs came and went. Henry VIII ruled with fury and fire. Elizabeth I carried England into a golden age. The Civil War tore the crown apart and stitched it back again. And still, the question never left. Where did the princes go? In 1674, nearly 2 centuries after the boys vanished, workmen demolishing a staircase in the White Tower uncovered a small wooden chest. Inside, 2 skeletons, small, fragile, twisted upon one another, no markings. No tomb, just bones in a box, sealed beneath stone. Charles II ordered them interred in Westminster Abbey, in an urn of black marble, and upon it, an inscription, a claim that these were the long-lost princes, Edward and Richard, but science had not yet learned the language of proof. No DNA, no forensic testing, only shape and size and guesswork. Even in rest, the boys were not given certainty that in the 20th century. The bones were briefly examined again. The doctors noted that they belonged to children of the right age, but the evidence was inconclusive, and no further examination was allowed. Requests for DNA testing denied. Royal permissions withheld, as if the truth, so long buried, might do more harm than good. As if some things must remain unanswered. Even now, the tower draws visitors from across the world. They walk the battlements. They gaze upon the ravens. They visit the crown jewels shining beneath glass, and some stop at the spot where the bones were found. They pause. They read the plaque. They wonder, not just about what happened, but why it has never been truly solved. Many theories have danced through the minds of historians. Did Richard III order the murder? It seems most likely that he had the motive. He had the means. He had, above all, the opportunity. But those who knew. Richard described a man of principle, a loyal brother, a shrewd but not heartless ruler. Could he have looked 2 sleeping nephews in the face and chosen death? And if not Richard, then who? Henry VII, desperate to solidify his new claim? The Duke of Buckingham, seeking to control the future from the shadows? Or an unnamed servant, acting without orders? Each answer leads to another door, and behind each door, only more silence. Sometimes, silence is its own answer, the kind of answer that lingers at the edge of history, never speaking but always present. Like fog that never lifts. Like the pause between heartbeat and breath. There were no witnesses. No blood. No confession. Just a disappearance. 2 boys, folded into legend. But legends leave shadows behind. Shadows that stretch across centuries. Shadows that speak even when no voice remains. And in those shadows, something eternal stirs. Not horror. Not vengeance, but grief. Grief for what was lost, not only 2 children, but the innocence of kingship itself. Edward V may have been a boy, but he stood, if only for a breath, at the very edge of destiny. A child carved for a crown, and then, taken, Richard of York, his little brother, followed him into the abyss. No throne, no story, only the echo of their names. Asterisk sometimes, when the moon is low over London, and the city sleeps beneath its lamps and car horns and dreams, a silence still falls upon the tower, and they say, if you listen closely, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps. 2 pairs, walking side by side, searching for a door that never opened. The tower remembers, and somewhere beneath its stone bones, the truth lies sleeping. Not forgotten, just waiting. Perhaps it will never be found. Perhaps it was never meant to be. Some mysteries do not need solving. They need only to be felt, held close, and mourned. The story of Edward V ends not with an answer, but with the quiet ache of something unfinished, something that slipped from the hands of history and vanished into the fog. Let it rest there, not with fire, not with fury, but with stillness, with silence, with the soft echo of two lost voices in the dark, calling out, perhaps, to be remembered. There are names that echo with beauty, and there are names that echo with fear. Nadir Shah was never meant to be beautiful. He came like a shadow rising from the salt-stained dust of Khorasan. Born of obscurity, bred by war, tempered by exile. The son of a herdsman, they said, a bandit's child, raised in tents, sleeping beneath stars, stealing to live, until, slowly, one by one, the empires began to speak his name. He was not born to rule, but he ruled, nonetheless, and not with pageantry or prayer, but with the blade. The year was 1736 when Nadir Shah crowned himself ruler of Persia. He wore a robe dyed in the blood of old dynasties. The Safavid line, once great, had crumbled, eaten away by weakness and invasion. Nadir, commander of men, guardian of the eastern frontiers, had carved the way forward with gunpowder and cunning. They say the crown sat heavy on his head, that it did not belong to him. But he wore it anyway. That he was no noble. But nobles bent the knee. That he was no prophet. But his word became law, and behind him marched a storm. Persia had long been caught between worlds, between Ottoman West and Mughal East. Nadir, always watching, saw the cracks spreading, saw the weak emperor in Delhi, distracted by silk and song, saw the riches, untouched, unguarded, flowing from a palace gilded in jewels, and he began to dream, not of conquest, no, but of loot. Of treasures too vast to count, of diamonds the size of apricots, of the peacock throne, woven with rubies and golden wings. That he saw it all. And in 1738, he moved. His march from Persia to India was a thing of dust and iron. 100,000 men, clad in steel and determination, carved their way across mountains, rivers, and plains. They sacked city after city, Kandahar, Kabul, Lahore, and then Delhi, the jewel of the Mughal world. A city so rich it glittered beneath the crescent moon. In February of 1739, Nadir Shah stood before its gates. The Emperor Muhammad Shah begged for terms. The gates opened, and Nadir entered a conqueror. They say Delhi welcomed him at first. There were feasts, gifts, cautious peace. But peace is a fragile candle, easily extinguished. A rumor spread. Persian soldiers had been killed. In the night, Nadir's eyes darkened. He gave a command, and what followed was not war. It was slaughtered. On a single day in March 1739, Delhi burned. Persian soldiers moved through the streets like smoke, door to door, blade to throat. Women screamed. Children vanished. Fire caught on silk banners and swept through stone temples. When it ended, the Ganges ran red. Some say 20,000 perished. Others say more. And at the center stood Nadir Shah, watching, calm, unflinching. As if death was simply a rearrangement of order, he took everything: the treasury, the thrones, the elephants and camels piled with gold, the peacock throne, once the pride of the Mughals, was dismantled, its precious birds clipped from their perch. The Koh-i-Noor and Darya-i-Noor diamonds glittered in his saddlebags. Delhi was emptied, its soul taken. And then, just as swiftly, Nadir turned and rode west. The journey back to Persia was slow, burdened by wealth, slowed by heat, stalked by resentment. But Nadir had what he wanted. He was now the richest man alive. His army fed, his throne secured. And yet, something shifted in him on the road home. A crack, invisible at first, Some say it was illness. Others say it was the taste of blood. Or perhaps he had glimpsed the hollowness of power, but he changed. Back in Persia, he ruled not as a hero, but as a tyrant. The crown he had won became a weight. He raised taxes to unthinkable heights, drained villages dry. He grew suspicious of allies, paranoid. Ministers were executed, generals imprisoned. Even his own son was blinded on his orders, and the people whispered the shepherd king had returned, not as savior, but as something darker that he no longer trusted anyone that he took to the road, never sleeping in the same place twice. He moved with a personal guard, tall men, silent and loyal. And even among them, he kept his distance that he began to speak of shadows, of plots, of ghosts. The treasure he had taken, so vast it could drown a kingdom, now seemed to haunt him. He feared it would be stolen. Hidden caches were said to be buried in the desert, never found. Some believe he buried parts of the peacock throne itself. Others speak of caverns filled with gold beneath the mountains of Khorasan, but no map remains. Only the tales. And then he vanished. The year was 1747. Nadir Shah, ruler of Persia, scourge of Delhi, keeper of the peacock throne, disappeared from history. No funeral, no body, no tomb, only a single account, whispered by his own guards. They say he was killed in his tent, in the deep hours of night, assassinated by his own officers, sick of cruelty, starved of mercy. One slit his throat. Another carried his head into the darkness. But when the tent was searched, the body was gone. There was no blood, no corpse, no proof. Gone like smoke. What does it mean to erase a man like Nadir, a man who had scarred empires, who had held the fate of kings in his palm, who had stolen thrones and broken cities, and yet no grave and no monument, only silence. Asterisk, the lands he had conquered soon fell into chaos. His empire shattered, his treasure never recovered in full. Pieces of the peacock throne vanished. The diamonds passed from hand to hand, carried across continents. The Kohinoor found its way into British hands, but the man himself slipped away to as if he had never existed at all. A shadow among kings, that a ghost crowned with stolen jewels today. Man who burned the world and then disappeared into it. The body was never seen again. And that, perhaps, is where the mystery truly begins. For men like Nadir Shah, who carved history with fire and gold, do not vanish without a trace. Not unless they wish to, or unless something darker intervenes. The accounts of his end are many, too many, each shaped by fear, ambition, or silence. Some whispered that the murder was real, that his closest officers, fed up with a tyrant's cruelty, slaughtered him in his tent one moonless night. They tell of a blade drawn across his throat, of hushed voices, of men stealing away under cover of darkness. Others swear that he escaped, that the death was staged, that the body never found was because it never existed to begin with. In the hills of Khorasan, where the winds never stop whispering, there are stories still told by old men around firelight. They say he rode into the mountains alone. Wounded, yes, but not dead. They say he took only one man with him, a mute servant, a boy who had once saved his life during a siege, who never left his side. Together, the two of them vanished into the cliffs to bury the last of his treasures, and perhaps himself. You see, the peacock throne was more than gold. It was myth. Built in the time of Shah Jahan, emperor of the Taj Mahal, it was no mere chair. It was a living tapestry of the Mughal Empire's pride, golden peacocks with ruby eyes, columns of emeralds and sapphires, a backrest crafted from diamonds, and at its heart, the two legendary stones, the Kohinoor. The Darya-Nor. When Nadir took the throne, he dismantled it, not as vandal, but as strategist. He scattered its jewels among his treasures. Some he wore, some he hid, but not all of them were ever found. In the years after his disappearance, rumors surfaced. Villagers spoke of hidden chambers in the mountains, of caravans swallowed by the desert, of lone riders found with their throats slit and their saddlebags emptied. The Shah's treasure, they said, was cursed or guarded. Some claimed a group of loyalists still protected it, descendants of his personal guard, living in secrecy, watching the passes. Others said the treasure had never existed at all, that Delhi had already been emptied by the time Nadir arrived, that the throne was a legend, built upon another legend. But the stones, they speak otherwise. Let us follow the diamonds. The Koh-i-Noor, fabled mountain of light, passed from Nadir to his successors, then was seized by Afghan warlords. It traded hands through bloodshed until finally, decades later, it found its way into the hands of the British East India Company. From there, into the British Crown, where it remains. But the Darya-Nor, the Sea of Light, vanished. Some say it remains in Iran, locked within the hidden vaults of Tehran. Others say it was recut, renamed, hidden in plain sight. No one agrees. The stones were more than gems. They were testaments to power. And symbols never die quietly. But what of Nadir himself? Even as new rulers fought over the ruins of his empire, his name refused to be buried. Stories leaked from distant towns that a traveler in Herat claimed to have met an old man with a scar across his cheek, calling himself only the Falcon. He paid with gold coins older than the empire itself, and vanished the next day. In the port of Bandar Abbas, a merchant told of a strange noble who arrived aboard a salt-stained ship, escorted by mute guards, and demanded charts of the Indian Ocean. He sailed at dawn, and was never seen again. And in the deep mountains of eastern Persia, caves were found. In 1856, a group of treasure hunters, inspired by tales of Nadir's gold, ventured into the remote Zagros Mountains. What they found was a network of carved tunnels, inside dust, bones, strange inscriptions, and in one chamber, an ivory comb set with a single blood-red ruby, peacock feathers etched into the handle. They brought it to Tehran. It was displayed for a year, then vanished from the record. Some say the crown itself, what remained of it, still lies in those caverns. Others believe it was ground to dust, scattered into rivers to prevent it from ever being seized. That a ruler obsessed with power may also become obsessed with erasing it. But there is one final tale, a peculiar one, a manuscript, hidden in the archives of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, discovered only in the 1990s. Its cover bore no title. Its pages were brittle with time. Within, an anonymous account. The Memoir of a Prisoner. A man captured by Nadir's army and taken across Persia. He describes the Shah not as a tyrant, but as a haunted man. One who woke in the night, whispering to shadows, who refused to sleep near mirrors, who spoke to an unseen figure named Ashina, a ghost, a memory, a sin-given voice. The prisoner writes of one final night. In a fortress in Mazandaran, the Shah dismissed his guards, ordered all doors shut till dawn. He was gone, no horse disturbed the ground. No footsteps marked the stone. Only silence, and a peacock feather left upon the floor. This account, too, is doubted. Many call it fiction, a scribe's fable, but what cannot be denied is that Nadir Shah disappeared in the most literal sense of the word. No grave, no relics, no funeral. His treasure, fragmented, stolen, mythologized. His empire, shattered. His name, remembered only in whispers. It is rare for a conqueror to fade. rarer still for a legend to scatter into fog. And yet, with Nadir Shah, that is precisely what happened. Somewhere beneath desert sands, perhaps, lies a vault, where jewels glint in candlelight, untouched for centuries. Or perhaps they're gone, taken long ago by hands now turned to dust. But in the still nights of eastern Persia, when the wind howls across ruined fortresses and stars blink above abandoned caravansaries, one might still hear hoofbeats, or glimpse, just beyond the firelight, a man wrapped in a tattered royal robe, watching, waiting. The flight of the peacock throne was not a journey of gold. It was a vanishing act, and its final chapter remains unwritten. Some say his ghost never left in the cool valleys of Mazandaran. Shepherds have spoken of an old rider, his face cloaked, his steed black as night. They call him Shahi Say, the Shadow King. No one dares follow him, for those who try never return the same. If they return at all, but not all who search for Nadir seek ghosts. Some seek the treasure. Still, they come with old maps and British names, with worn journals passed down through generations, with teeth bared in gold lust, drawn to the whispers like moths to dying embers. One such map appeared in 1908. It came into the possession of a Russian cartographer stationed near the Persian border. It had no signature, just a series of crumbling parchment sheets bound with twine, covered in odd marks, half Farsi, half dash ciphered, at its center, one symbol repeated, a crown broken in two, with a peacock feather between. The cartographer vanished a year later. His belongings were auctioned off. The map was never found again. But the stories did not stop in the narrow alleys of Tehran's oldest bazaar, where time folds in upon itself and cinnamon mingles with the scent of ink and brass. A bookseller once told a peculiar tale. He was old, bent, but his memory burned bright. He spoke of a man who came one rainy night in 1932, dressed like a scholar, spoke Persian like a foreigner, that he asked for books, not on Nadir Shah, but on his physician. Odd. Most had forgotten the man entirely, but not this stranger. He paid handsomely for a tattered volume, one few had ever touched. Inside, scrawled in a margin, was a peculiar line. When the Shah bled stars, the physician wept into his wine. The scholar left, but returned a year later, thin, ill, and quiet as snow. That he returned the book. But the margin was blank. That it was not the only mystery tied to the peacock throne's flight. There is the letter, buried in the archives of a British estate, unearthed by chance in the 1970s, written in 1749 by a young officer of the East India Company, stationed near Kandahar. He writes of a man, tall, scarred, dressed in rags, yet walking like a king. The officer's servant swore it was Nadir Shah. Impossible, the officer wrote. But he could not shake the encounter. His eyes, he wrote, burned not with madness, but memory. He asked no questions, only stared at the mountain beyond the fort, as if it whispered to him. The letter ends abruptly. The officer drowned weeks later. A boating accident, or so the records claim. What complicates the mystery is not just his disappearance, but the silence that followed. You see, in the East, even the most feared men are mourned when they fall. But Nadir received no mourning, no mourning rites, no shrines, only silence. His dynasty ended with a breath. His son, Ali Kohli, claimed the throne, declared his father dead. But no body was shown. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, not out of grief, but dread. That it was as if the very soil feared to say his name. And then came the curse. For every man who took something of Nadir's, be it ruby, relic, or robe, met strange ends. That a general who claimed one of his emeralds died. Choking on gold dust in Shiraz, that a merchant who wore his sword vanished in the salt flats of Dashti Caver. Only his horse returned, eyes wide with terror. An English diplomat, gifted a sapphire from Nadir's court, went mad aboard a ship bound for Bombay. He leapt into the sea, babbling about firebirds and mirrors that bled. Coincidence? Or did the blood Nadir spilled cling to his treasures like a shadow? Some scholars insist he was buried in a secret tomb near Mashhad. A few even claim they found it, a sunken chamber beneath a ruined caravanserai. But when they returned with excavation tools, the structure had collapsed. All they recovered was a single silver ring, engraved with a lion, and a single Persian word, Bakht. Fate. No tomb has ever been confirmed, and none wear the ring now. But let us not forget, history is not always written by the living. Sometimes it is carved in ash. There exists in the ruins of a once glorious observatory near Isfahan a curious painting, or rather, a fresco, partially destroyed, weather-worn. It shows a man on a crumbling throne, surrounded by birds, not peacocks, but crows, dozens of them, pecking at his robes. And behind him, a door stands open, leading into a mountain. Beneath the image, faded nearly beyond reading, is a phrase. The king who looked too long at the stars forgot his shadow. Its meaning? Unclear. But the observatory had been commissioned by Nadir himself. In modern times, treasure hunters still whisper of the lost vaults. Documentaries hint at it. Myth chasers draw lines across satellite maps, tracing ancient roads and forgotten wells. They speak of three primary theories. The Herat theory, that his gold was smuggled into the citadel vaults beneath Herat, now sealed under layers of modern construction. The Nishaper caverns, natural caves turned treasure chambers, long collapsed but once mapped by his engineers. The Lake Comtrap, a decoy site rigged with booby traps, where Nadir's greed lured his enemies, not his treasure. None have yielded results. But then again, some things are not meant to be found. And yet, one tale refuses to die. A tale not of where Nadir went, but why he vanished. It claims that in his final years, the Shah believed he was cursed, that he'd inherited something foul from the Mughal emperors, something ancient, a jinn bound to the peacock throne itself. This jinn, some said, whispered to him at night, fed his paranoia, drove him to kill his own sons, his wives, his generals, until one night, in the thick silence of a moonless evening, he vanished to banish it, not to hide from men, but to trap a demon. Strange, isn't it, that a man could conquer so much, yet lose himself. A throne too dazzling to hold, a treasure too poisoned to spend, and a legacy that slipped like sand through time's fingers. They say when the sun strikes the right corner of the ruined observatory at dawn, a shadow falls not from the tower, but into it. A man's shape, tall, crowned, cloaked in silence, watching, always watching. It was nearly midnight when the storm passed, leaving behind nothing but wind-washed stones and uneasy silence over the camp. The air still smelled of steel and burnt oil, and somewhere distant, a horse neighed nervously as if it, too, had sensed something amiss. By morning, the guards were found asleep, some drugged, some dead. The tent where Nadir Shah had slept, the crimson imperial enclosure with the lion banners, stood oddly untouched. Not looted, not disturbed, but he was gone. The shadow of a king had slipped between the folds of reality, leaving no blood, no witness, no sign of death. Only absence. First, his commanders assumed betrayal. It was not uncommon in those years for great men to die at the hands of their own kin or most trusted guards. A soldier who had once stood sentry at Nadir's door would later speak of a whisper in the dark, the sound of silk brushing against the earth, and footsteps that did not echo like a man's. Others whispered something else, that the king had never died, that he had simply escaped, escaped with the peacock throne hidden in carts disguised as cattle wagons, escaped with emeralds the size of a child's fist tied under his coat, escaped into the deserts where no one would look for an emperor with blood on his hands. There were stories, so many stories, that a man claiming to be Nadir was seen in a caravan near Khorasan, bearded and aged, but carrying a dagger with rubies carved in a Persian star. Another tale told of a ruined fortress in the Zagros Mountains, where a madman who muttered poetry in court Persian spoke of thrones and betrayals and treasure buried beneath rivers that no longer flowed. In the port town of Bandar Abbas, an old sailor once said he ferried a man with a panther tattoo on his back, the very same tattoo the king bore from his youth, across the sea to Basra. He paid in gold coins that had been stamped decades earlier, bearing a mint mark only struck during Nadir's final year of rule. And yet, there was no proof, only fragments, glimmers, hints. The world moved on. The Afsharid dynasty crumbled without its terrifying patriarch. Persia splintered again, a mosaic of governors and claimants and invaders. But no one ever truly replaced him. No bones were ever found, no burial. No state funeral, no scribe recorded his last words. Nor was any epitaph ever carved in stone. It was as if a storm had risen, shattered the earth, and then disappeared into its own winds, leaving only silence in its wake. Some say the assassins were never punished because they were never real. Some say he slipped through a tunnel beneath the camp, leading into an abandoned aqueduct system once carved for Sassanid kings. That he had planned it all. The disappearance, the decoys, the bodies. That even death could be fooled if one had ruled long enough and cruelly enough to command it. And then, there are others, those who believe that the peacock throne itself, soaked in blood, glittering with stones pulled from ancient gods, was cursed, that whoever stole it was doomed to vanish, as if the throne demanded its owner be devoured by history. The throne did vanish, after all, not just once, twice, 3 times, perhaps, always slipping from empire to empire, kingdom to kingdom, until it was no longer a throne at all, but a memory of stolen glory. Some say it still exists, buried in vaults far from where it was born, its gold eaten by time, its rubies dull with dust, its legacy still venomous, and the man who once sat upon it, a boy from humble birth, a soldier made king, a king made butcher. Perhaps he wanders still, if not in flesh, then in memory, a shadow on a desert hill, a face glimpsed in the corners of old paintings, a name whispered by those who dream of power and vanish instead. In the end, we do not know how Nadir Shah died, nor where he rests. We only know that he left behind a throne no one should have touched, and silence where his echo should have been. A silence deeper than history itself, a quiet that has never quite ended. The city had always known how to whisper. From her golden gates to her shadowed cisterns, Constantinople murmured, with prayers, with plotting, with the slow breath of time. That in May of 1453, the whispers turned to wailing. And yet, even as the cannons roared and minarets loomed like blackened spears beyond the walls, there remained, within those last days, a stillness. The stillness of something ancient preparing to slip away. Constantine XI Palaiologos, the last emperor of Byzantium, stood before that twilight, not as a conquering sovereign, but as a man born into the closing of a book. That he was no boy, nor myth-chosen hero. He was 50 years of age, sharp-eyed, plain of speech, neither too proud nor too poetic. His crown sat lighter on his head than the memory of all who'd worn it before him. He did not speak of destiny. He spoke of duty outside the city walls. Mim, too, young, brilliant, and relentless, brought with him something far more terrifying than death: finality. Gunpowder, logic, empire reborn under a new banner. Inside the walls, dwindling food, splintered loyalties, and churches that smelled more of ash than incense. But there were stories, still. Some said the Virgin Mary herself had cloaked the city, that the Theotokos would not let Constantinople fall. Others whispered of angels seen on the ramparts at night, drifting like smoke between crenellations. And yet, each morning, the stone walls cracked a little more beneath Mim's great bombard. Each night, prayers grew shorter. Fewer candles were lit. Even in the imperial palace, the Blacherny, worn and weary with age, there was little splendor left. The mosaics still shimmered in places, yes, but dust clung to the corners like a warning. The once grand court had been reduced to scholars, priests, and loyal captains whose swords had seen better days. Still, Constantine ruled, he wrote. Along the walls by torchlight, he listened. He prayed. He patched cracks with faith and sandbags. He did not run. Perhaps he knew that the city would outlive him, even in ruin. But what he did not know, what no one did, was how he would vanish on the night of May 28th. The bells rang through the broken streets. Not for warning, not for mourning, for liturgy, the final service of Hagia Sophia. By then, the great church was no longer just Orthodox. Catholics stood beside Greeks. Mercenaries knelt beside bishops. Even children lined the aisles, clutching each other's hands like rosaries. Some wept. Some stared blankly into the mosaic eyes of Christ above them. Constantine came last. He entered humbly, without crown or armor. He kissed the icons. He whispered confessions to men who had served him for years, and asked forgiveness. A few said he trembled. Others said he was calm, radiant even, like a man who'd already stepped outside of time. Outside, the sky churned with strange colors. One soldier swore he saw a second moon hanging low over the Sea of Marmara. Another claimed a comet passed just before dawn. But the records, what few remain, agree on this. The emperor rose before daybreak, donned his armor, and mounted his horse. That he rode through the gate of St. Romanus, toward the very wall. Mehmed would breach. His captains begged him to retreat into the palace, to survive. But he shook his head, saying, "I am no emperor without my city." And that was the last anyone saw him as a man. The final breach came in smoke and fire. Janissaries surged through the walls like floodwaters. The defenders broke. Some fled. Some were cut down. Some knelt in the blood-soaked dust and wept. But Constantine, no corpse was ever found. No enemy could say they struck the blow. Some claimed he was seen fighting atop a ruined tower, sword flashing like a pale flame. Others said he vanished into the crush, pulled beneath a tide of bodies. But there were those, quiet voices, kept for decades, who told stranger tales. That a monk in Thessaloniki swore the emperor had not died at all, that he had been hidden beneath the streets by angels, turned to marble, waiting, sleeping. Another tale told of a rider, veiled in silver light, seen years later in the Carpathians, wearing Eastern armor and bearing a banner no one recognized. And one story, more whispered than spoken, claimed the ghost of the emperor still walked the old cisterns beneath Hagia Sophia, his footsteps echoing like water in the dark. What becomes of a man when his death is unwitnessed? Does he die at all? Or does he remain unfinished, like a candle never quite extinguished? As the sun rose over the fallen city, Mem too entered. Hagia Sophia. He ordered the great bells silenced. The mosaics covered that he prayed, but somewhere in the silence, there may still have been the faintest breath of another presence. A lingering warmth. The empire was gone, but not, perhaps, its soul. And in that vanished emperor, whose grave was never dug, whose crown was never buried, a mystery was born. Point one, not of politics or conquest, but of haunting that of a man who became a ghost not through death, but through absence. And that is where we pause, at the edge of a broken wall, beneath a sky dimmed by smoke and myth, waiting for the shadow of a king who may still be riding. The marble under Constantinople was said to be hollow with secrets. Cisterns, tunnels, crypts, some ancient even before the first dome of Hagia Sophia had risen. There were rumors among the old palace guards that beneath the hippodrome lay a chamber where emperors once walked barefoot into icy pools before coronation, that some stairways beneath the palace spiraled not upward, but downward forever, toward vaults only angels and devils dared enter. And now, after the fall, these caverns became graveyards of memory. The Ottomans filled the streets above with new song, new language, new prayer, but something still breathed below. They said the water in the basilica cistern never stilled after 1453, that even in the quietest hour of night, ripples would dance across its surface, though no wind nor rat disturbed it. And sometimes, if one lingered, there would come a sound like armored footsteps, or the faint clink of a sword hilt against stone. The first true account of the ghost emperor came not from the Byzantines themselves, but from an Italian merchant, Girolamo d'Arezzo, writing decades after the conquest that he had journeyed to Constantinople for trade, but spent most of his silver bribing guards and scholars for tales of the old city. That in his journal, he recounts an encounter in the substructure of the ruined Blachurni Palace. A Turkish janissary, drunk and pale-faced, refused to descend into a particular stairwell, claiming he had once seen a figure in blood-red robes with a sword of bone, standing without breath. Girolamo descended himself. Torch in hand, he wrote. The air grew so cold it cracked the sweat on my skin. I felt watched, not by men, nor spirits of air, but by memory itself. Then I heard it, a rustle of cloak, not 6 paces behind me. I turned. Nothing. When he returned to his quarters, he found a single coin in his pocket, Byzantine, stamped with the sigil of Constantine XI. That he never returned to the city. But this was only the beginning. That in 1511, an earthquake rattled the city. Many buildings cracked. The ground near the Golden Horn split open. A boy chasing goats stumbled into one of the new fissures and fell into a chamber no one remembered. The locals hauled him out by rope, trembling and silent. That it was days before he spoke, and when he did, he told of a figure asleep on a stone chair, armored, with a broken crown in his lap. Not skeletal, not rotted. Sleeping, he said. The man opened one eye, and then the chamber sealed itself. The priest called. It blasphemy. The boy vanished months later. Some say the janissaries took him. Others believe he simply wandered back into the dark, searching in the decades that followed. Constantine XI became more than a memory. He became a possibility. A phantom thread, tugging at the soul of the old city, some of the city's oldest. Families whispered that he had made a pact, not with God, but with Constantinople itself, that he would not die while the city still bore his name, that he would return when she called. And so, secret shrines began to appear, hidden in basements, tucked behind mosaics, etched faintly into old column stones. A hand clutching a broken sword, a lion with 2 faces, a red cloak hung from a nail. The Ottomans never knew. Or perhaps they did, and allowed it. After all, what harm was a ghost to an empire reborn? But still, the rumors grew. In the 17th century, a Greek nun in the Fanner Quarter claimed to receive visions, always at night, always the same. A man in ancient armor, standing knee-deep in water beneath the city. He never spoke, but each time she awoke, her hands were stained with soot. She died with his name on her lips. Asterisk in time. Constantine, she's mystery transformed. He was no longer just the final emperor. He became the hidden one. The city's soul, buried but unbroken, poets wrote of him walking the walls in moonlight. Children dared each other to touch the emperor's gate in the old wall, still blackened from cannon fire. One story claimed that during a plague, a woman in rags nursed the sick near the city's edge. No one knew her. She never slept. One evening, someone followed her and saw her kneel before a stone lion. She whispered, "Rise soon, my king." And when they turned to ask her name, she was gone. By the 19th century, the legend had crossed borders. A Russian Tsar sent scholars to study the ruins of Constantinople. One of them, Alexei Morozov, vanished for 3 days near the Yedikul fortress. When he returned, his hair had turned white. He would never speak of what he'd seen, except once, to a priest. He waits still, not dead, not dreaming. His sword is rusted, but his heart burns like a coal beneath the sea. The priest asked him where. Alexei only replied, "Beneath the dome that no longer shines." Time continued. Empires rose, fell, bled into each other. But through it all, one tale remained unchanged, that an emperor had not died, but had vanished. That his absence became a beacon for the city's soul. That in the old earth, where torches do not burn and echoes cannot flee, he waits, perhaps not for vengeance, not even for victory, but for memory. To be remembered is to exist. And in that haunting, Constantine 11 remained in no grave, no epitaph, only a ghost with a crown of ash, and a city that still whispered his name beneath the stones. The Ottomans renamed the city Istanbul. They raised minarets where bells once rang. They poured sand over mosaics, built palaces of their own, and gave the marble domes new prayers to echo. But empires are strange things. They do not simply erase the ones before them. Instead, they carry their bones in their foundations. And the bones of Byzantium were restless. By the 1800s, travelers from the West began to flood the ancient city once again. Painters, poets, scholars, they came in droves. All of them enchanted by the ruins, the relics, the hollow-eyed statues that stared without blinking. But some came searching for something older than art, something never written in history books. That a few had read obscure tomes tucked in the back, shelves of dusty Italian monasteries, manuscripts that spoke not of the conquest, but of what came after. They came chasing the legend of Constantine 11. Such man was Charles Lockett, an English antiquarian. In 1842, he spent 6 months mapping the ancient underground aqueducts. He bribed Ottoman guards, paid fishermen for tales, and learned Greek from a priest who only whispered when speaking of the emperor. Lockett left behind a series of journals, most mundane, until the final entry he wrote. I found it, not the emperor himself, but a room of silence. Beneath the Theodosian wall, through a passage choked with dust and centuries. There were no markings save a small carving of a lion with its mouth sewn shut. I stepped inside. The air was cold, still, and then I heard it, a single footstep, deliberate and heavy, though I stood alone. The journal ends there. Lockett disappeared that spring. His luggage remained in his room, untouched, no one ever found his body. Even Ottoman officials could not ignore the myth forever. By the early 1900s, a quiet anxiety had crept into Istanbul's underbelly. Too many disappeared. Too many stories. A night watchman posted near the Valens Aqueduct reported an incident in 1907. While patrolling near the ancient stone span, he saw a figure in armor standing at the edge of the arches. He described the figure as not moving, not breathing, but present. The man fled, but when he returned with another guard, the figure had vanished, leaving only scorched footprints in the stone. The Ottoman police dismissed it as hysteria. Yet within the week, that watchman disappeared. His boots were found at the base of the aqueduct, empty. Not all sightings were so dramatic. Most were fleeting, almost gentle, haunting rather than threatening. An old washerwoman near the Golden Horn told of a man who passed her stall each dusk. She said he nodded, always courteous, dressed not in modern robes, but in faded crimson. She assumed he was a poor scholar. Until one evening, he paused and said, in a voice not quite aligned with time, "Have the bells rung yet, mother?" She asked, "Which bells?" He looked confused, then smiled faintly. "The bells of Hagia Sophia. When they toll, I shall rise." He vanished into the alley. She never saw him again. The belief was not only that Constantine XI had survived in spirit. Some said his body itself had never decayed, that he had been taken by the marble itself, drawn into the bones of the city like a pearl swallowed by a shell. And beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, where dust gathered in shadows and light slanted like a divine blade, his echoes still lingered. A few dared believe that he lived, not in the way mortals do, but as an ember hidden beneath a layer of ashed in the decades after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The myth only deepened. Greek scholars, freed from centuries of silence, began to speak openly of the Marble Emperor. They claimed he had made a pact with the angels of Constantinople. One tale said that in the final hour of the siege, as Mehmed's army stormed the gates, Constantine stood before the altar of Hagia Sophia, crown in hand. He knelt and whispered, "If I cannot save her, then let me become her." And the walls responded. A flash of light, a crack of thunder. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. Only his sword remained, buried in the floor. The Ottomans never found it. An Istanbul historian named Yusuf Kara penned a controversial paper in 1932. In it, he claimed that an archaeological dig near the Serpent Column had uncovered a sealed chamber, a room with no entrance, no exit. Inside, there were 13 statues of emperors, but the final pedestal was empty. Its inscription read only, Omicron Nu Alpha Theta Omicron Lambda Theta Omicron. The living stone. The Turkish government seized the documents. The chamber was resealed. Kara was quietly dismissed from his university. He left Istanbul, never wrote again. Decades rolled on. Wars reshaped the world. The marble cracked. Cities modernized. But even in the new Istanbul, the old stories whispered. A tram conductor in 1965 claimed that on foggy mornings, his trolley would slow, not from engine failure, but as if the tracks themselves resisted. Always near the old palace wall. Always at 4:53 a.m., he once saw a man walking alongside the tram, wearing a crown fashioned of twisted wire. He thought it was a madman, until he blinked, and the figure vanished into the fog. Only his reflection remained. In the window glass, staring back with silver eyes. Tourists in the 1980s began to report strange experiences in the basilica cistern. Not ghosts, not visions, but a presence. A sense that the water itself held a memory. That something was listening. One visitor from Athens claimed that while photographing the Medusa heads, her camera refused to work. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. When she turned, she saw only her own shadow. But her tape recorder, which she had forgotten to turn off, captured a sound, a whisper. In ancient Greek, asterisk still I stand. My sword sleeps beneath the city. She mailed the tape to a university. It was lost in transit in 2002 during a routine maintenance check under Topkapi Palace. A Turkish engineer stumbled upon an irregular section of wall behind an old drainage pipe. The stone was softer there. Hollow. He tapped it, and it crumbled. Inward, beyond lay a passage not listed in any blueprint. He ventured inside. His flashlight flickered, then died. He crawled back out an hour later, clothes torn, face white with dust, and feared he told no one, except a friend who shared the tale anonymously years later. He said there was a man inside, sitting on a throne, eyes closed. A crack ran down his chest, like a statue weathered by time. But he was not stone. He was breathing, slowly. What do we make of these stories? In a city built atop itself, where every stone bears the fingerprint of emperors and rebels alike, is it so hard to believe in one who refused to die? Constantine 11 Paleologos, last emperor of Rome, last to stand beneath the falling walls. Left behind no tomb and no grave, only a wound in history and some wounds do not close. Children still whisper his name when they pass the old gates. Fishermen toss offerings into the Bosphorus during storms, hoping he keeps the waves calm. Old women light candles not only for saints, but for the emperor with no grave, whose crown was forged in fire, and whose vigil beneath the stones has never ended. That he is not a ghost. They say that he is the memory of sovereignty itself, the breath caught in a city's throat, waiting for bells that may never ring, for walls that may never rise. But should they ever sound again, should the lion banners fly once more from Hagia Sophia's dome, then he, too, shall return, not with vengeance, not with wrath, but with eyes of marble, and a sword that sings of centuries. The Ottomans renamed the city Istanbul. They raised minarets where bells once rang. They poured sand over mosaics, built palaces of their own, and gave the marble domes new prayers to echo. But empires are strange things. They do not simply erase the ones before them. Instead, they carry their bones in their foundations. And the bones of Byzantium were restless. By the 1800s, travelers from the West began to flood the ancient city once again. Painters, poets, scholars, they came in droves. All of them enchanted by the ruins, the relics, the hollow-eyed statues that stared without blinking. But some came searching for something older than art, something never written in history books that a few had read, obscure tomes tucked in the back, shelves of dusty Italian monasteries, manuscripts that spoke not of the conquest, but of what came after. They came chasing the legend of Constantine 11.1. Such man was Charles Lockett, an English antiquarian that in 1842. He spent 6 months mapping the ancient underground aqueducts. He bribed Ottoman guards, paid fishermen for tales, and learned Greek from a priest who only whispered when speaking of the emperor. Lockett left behind a series of journals, most mundane, until the final entry he wrote. I found it, not the emperor himself, but a room of silence. Beneath the Theodosian wall, through a passage choked with dust and centuries. There were no markings save a small carving of a lion with its mouth sewn shut. I stepped inside. The air was cold, still, and then I heard it, a single footstep, deliberate and heavy, though I stood alone. The journal ends there. Lockett disappeared that spring. His luggage remained in his room, untouched, and no one ever found his body. Even Ottoman officials could not ignore the myth forever. By the early 1900s, a quiet anxiety had crept into Istanbul's underbelly. Too many disappeared. Too many stories. A night watchman posted near the Valens aqueduct reported an incident in 1907. While patrolling near the ancient stone span, he saw a figure in armor standing at the edge of the arches. He described the figure as not moving, not breathing, but present. The man fled, but when he returned with another guard, the figure had vanished, leaving only scorched footprints in the stone. The Ottoman police dismissed it as hysteria, yet within the week, that watchman disappeared. His boots were found at the base of the aqueduct, empty. Not all sightings were so dramatic. Most were fleeting, almost gentle, haunting rather than threatening. An old washerwoman near the Golden Horn told of a man who passed her stall each dusk. She said he nodded, always courteous, dressed not in modern robes, but in faded crimson. She assumed he was a poor scholar. Until one evening, he paused and said, in a voice not quite aligned with time, "Have the bells rung yet, mother?" She asked, "Which bells?" He looked confused, then smiled faintly. "The bells of Hagia Sophia, when they toll, I shall rise." He vanished into the alley. She never saw him again. The belief was not only that Constantine XI had survived in spirit. Some said his body itself had never decayed, that he had been taken by the marble itself, drawn into the bones of the city like a pearl swallowed by a shell. And beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, where dust gathered in shadows and light slanted like a divine blade, his echo still lingered. A few dared believe that he lived, not in the way mortals do, but as an ember hidden beneath a layer of ash. In the decades after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the myth only deepened. Greek scholars, freed from centuries of silence, began to speak openly of the Marble Emperor. They claimed he had made a pact with the angels of Constantinople. One tale said that in the final hour of the siege, as Mehmed's army stormed the gates, Constantine stood before the altar of Hagia Sophia. Crown in hand, he knelt and whispered, "If I cannot save her, then let me become her." And the walls responded. A flash of light, a crack of thunder. When the smoke cleared, he was gone. Only his sword remained, buried in the floor. The Ottomans never found it. An Istanbul historian named Yusuf Kara penned a controversial paper in 1932. In it, he claimed that an archaeological dig near the Serpent Column had uncovered a sealed chamber, a room with no entrance, no exit. Inside it were 13 statues of emperors, but the final pedestal was empty. Its inscription read only, Omicron nu alpha theta Omicron lambda theta Omicron. The living stone. The Turkish government seized the documents. The chamber was resealed. Kara was quietly dismissed from his university. He left Istanbul, never wrote again. The decades rolled on. Wars reshaped the world. The marble cracked. Cities modernized. But even in the new Istanbul, the old stories whispered. That a tram conductor in 1965 claimed that on foggy mornings, his trolley would slow, not from engine failure, but as if the tracks themselves resisted. Always near the old palace wall. Always at 4:53 a.m. he once saw a man walking alongside the tram, wearing a crown fashioned of twisted wire. He thought it was a madman, until he blinked, and the figure vanished into the fog. Only his reflection remained. In the window glass, staring back with silver eyes. Tourists in the 1980s began to report strange experiences in the basilica cistern. Not ghosts, not visions, but a presence. A sense that the water itself held a memory, that something was listening. One visitor from Athens claimed that while photographing the Medusa heads, her camera refused to work. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate. When she turned, She saw only her own shadow. But her tape recorder, which she had forgotten to turn off, captured a sound, a whisper. In ancient Greek, still I stand. My sword sleeps beneath the city. She mailed the tape to a university. It was lost in transit in 2002 during a routine maintenance check under Topkapi Palace. A Turkish engineer stumbled upon an irregular section of wall behind an old drainage pipe. The stone was softer there. Hollow. He tapped it, and it crumbled inward. Beyond lay a passage not listed in any blueprint. He ventured inside. His flashlight flickered, then died. He crawled back out an hour later, clothes torn, face white with dust, and feared he told no one, except a friend, who shared the tale anonymously years later. He said there was a man inside, sitting on a throne, eyes closed. A crack ran down his chest, like a statue weathered by time. But he was not stone. He was breathing, slowly. What do we make of these stories? In a city built atop itself, where every stone bears the fingerprint of emperors and rebels alike, is it so hard to believe in one who refused to die? Constantine 11 Paleologos, last emperor of Rome, last to stand beneath the falling walls, left behind no tomb, no grave, only a wound in history, and some wounds do not close. Children still whisper his name when they pass the old gates. Fishermen toss offerings into the Bosphorus during storms, hoping he keeps the waves calm. Old women light candles not only for saints, but for the emperor with no grave, whose crown was forged in fire, and whose vigil beneath the stones has never ended. He is not a ghost. They say that he is the memory of sovereignty itself, the breath caught in a city's throat, waiting for bells that may never ring, for walls that may never rise. But should they ever sound again, should the lion banners fly once more from Hagia Sophia's dome, then he, too, shall return, not with vengeance, not with wrath, but with eyes of marble, and a sword that sings of centuries. The bells of Edinburgh did not ring that day, nor the next, nor for many long days after, for silence fell hard upon Scotland in the autumn of 1513, a silence not born of peace, but of absence. The king had ridden south. He had led his men through the green and gold glens, across river and ravine, through forests dark with pine and clouds. He had crossed into England, proud, righteous, draped in the banners of saints and saltire. But he did not return. James IV, King of Scots, warrior, reformer, Renaissance prince, was gone, and the land, it mourned with quiet restraint, not with wails, nor keening women, nor great funerals, because no grave had been dug, no bier laid, no crown passed from flesh to stone. There had been a battle. Yes, Flodden. The word hung like iron in the mouths of all who dared speak it, and the wind that blew across that cursed field was red. James Stuart had never been a passive king. He was no trembling heir raised in the corners of courtly shadows. He had ruled with a firm, intelligent hand since his youth, ascending the throne not by destiny's design, but by the failure of blood. His father had died a traitor to the church. His kingdom had been carved thin by the English blade. And James, young, fierce, and oddly charismatic, vowed never to die a pawn. That he built ships, strong and sleek, and sent them across northern waters like steel-sworn heralds. He studied medicine and alchemy, astronomy and architecture. He walked among monks and masons, debated with scholars, and spoke Latin with the fluency of an old Roman soul. And he waited. He waited for a moment to rise. That it came, as such moments often do, wrapped in fire and faith. In the year of 1513, England's king, Henry VIII, marched his army into France. His eyes set upon glory and conquest, He left his borders vulnerable. James, bound by the old alliance with France, seized the moment. He would strike. He would fulfill the promise of a friend, and perhaps rewrite Scotland's fate upon English soil that he summoned his banners. The great lords of the Highlands and Lowlands alike came forth. Douglas, Home, Hintley, Errold, he marched with an army vast and proud, swelled by fervor and prophecy. Prophecy, yes, that strange and ever-simmering kettle of Scottish fate. For, long before the clash of arms, there had been whispers that a woman, a seer, known to some as the Lothian Sibyl, she warned the king, "If ye go to Flodden Field, ye shall not return." James heard, but he did not listen. Or if he did, he folded the words deep into the pocket of his soul, where men keep their fears buried beneath the thundering march of pride. And so he crossed the border, not by stealth, nor by small company, but in thunder and fire that he took Narm Castle. He ravaged the lands about the Tweed. And then he waited. But it was not Henry who met him. It was a man far colder. Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, veteran of war, tempered by years and scars, gathered the English levies. They met James at a place the Scots had fortified, on high ground, near Brankston Hill. But the English, they did not attack headlong. They moved. They flanked. They shifted the shape of the battlefield itself. And James, he made a fatal choice. He descended from his high position, down into the wet and narrow fields, down into the sodden ground that would become his grave. The Battle of Flodden was not swift, that it was brutal. Confused, choked with fog and slaughter, the Scottish pikes, long and gleaming, were hampered by the sod. The English bills, shorter, crueler, quicker, cut through them like knives through wheat. Men sank into the earth, their cries muffled by mud and blood, and James fought among them. Unlike many kings, he did not command from afar. He led from the front, that he charged with his spearmen, sword in hand, royal banner flying above him. Witnesses said he was seen striking down foes with fury. Some claimed he wore no armor upon his face, that he refused a helm, so God might decide his fate without shadow. Others swore he wept as he fought, not from fear, but from the certainty that he would not leave this field when the battle ended. Night had already claimed the hills. Thousands lay dead. A generation of Scottish nobility wiped out in a single gory day, and James vanished. There were stories, so many stories. The English said they had found his body among the dead, that he bore wounds to the neck, the face, the wrist, that he had been stripped, embalmed, and carried to London. But there were doubts, always doubts. Some claimed the body was never confirmed, that the man taken was too mutilated to be known for sure. Others whispered that the king had not died at all, that in the chaos he had fled, that he had cast aside his crown and walked, silent and unshod, into the forests beyond that Tio live in exile. Haunted, alone, a king without a name. The bells of Scotland did not toll, for no death had been seen, and no body had been returned. And in the courts and cloisters, the question began to echo like a hollow drum. Where is the king? Where is James? And will he come again? The battlefield had long cooled. The bodies, so many bodies, lay blanketed by frost and sorrow, heaped like felled trees where once they had stood proud in tartan and steel. But the king was missing, not missing in the way of a knight, lost in the press of war, not missing in the way of a soldier left unnamed among the anonymous dead. James IV was missing in a way that a king should never be. There was no confirmation, no funeral, no tomb. The English swore they had him, that his corpse, pierced and bloodied, was carried from the field by Surrey's men, embalmed in haste, and brought south to Henry's court. They said the wounds told the tale, one to the jaw, another to the hand, defensive, almost desperate, and finally a mortal slash near the neck. And yet, and yet the body was never shown to the people, never displayed in London, nor laid to rest in St. Paul's, nor buried with dignity in Westminster Abbey. Instead, it was kept quietly and with suspicion because James had been excommunicated by the church, a king condemned by Rome for waging war against another Christian monarch. And so, despite Henry's triumph, the church denied burial that a king without a grave, that a body without a crown, that a silence that grew louder with each passing day that I in the Highlands. They said he had escaped, that in the chaos of Flodden, when lords and liegemen fell like grass before a blade, the king had seen death loom and turned away, that he had thrown down his royal surcoat, stained with mud and blood, and walked alone into the woodlands, where the heather met the sky. There, among the moss and the mist, he shed the name of James. Took no title, claimed no throne. Some said he sought penance, that the prophecy, long whispered by the Lothian Sibyl, had come to haunt him not in death, but in shame. If you go to Flodden Field, you shall not return. She had not said he would die, only that he would not return, and indeed, he never did, not as king, not as man, only as shadow. Years passed, and with them came sightings, as they always do, when legends are born not of fable, but of confusion. In 1514, a full year after Flodden, a traveler in the Hebrides swore he had seen James in the robes of a monk, tending a fire in a stone chapel that had no name. He spoke little, the traveler said, but his hands, those royal hands, were ink-stained, calloused with prayer. In 1517, a sailor from Bruges told a tale of a Scottish noble, scarred, aged, but unmistakably regal, who passed through the ports of Flanders under guard of mercenaries. T. bore a sword with a thistle etched in the hilt. In 1522, a shepherd near Coldstream claimed a hooded man had wandered through the fog, leaving behind coins minted in 1513 and humming a tune that no commoner should have known. A royal lullaby. The stories swirled. Some were lies. Others felt too strange to dismiss. But the question remained, why would a king vanish himself? Why abandon crown, son, kingdom? Why choose silence over state? Perhaps the answer lies not in politics, but in grief. James was not a cold king. He had ruled with heart, with pain, with memory. He had worn a chain around his waist, a relic of penance for the death of his father. He had walked barefoot to shrines, prayed in the bitter Highland frost, laid offerings not to gods of conquest, but of mercy. Perhaps Flodden shattered more than an army. Perhaps it shattered something within him. The deaths that day were not merely soldiers and lords. They were friends, cousins, men who had danced with him in feast halls and fought beside him in war. And when they fell, one by one, on the bloodied slope of Branxton, perhaps James, wounded, cornered, stripped of command, looked upon the ruin of his kingdom and chose exile, not to hide, but to repent. Still, there were those who believed in his return, not as a man of flesh, but as a prophecy reborn, the legend of the king who sleeps, a motif as old as Arthur, as distant as Constantinople, found its place in Scottish myth. James, it was said, would return when Scotland's need was direst, when the thistle bled, when the rivers ran black and the lion rampant no longer roared. Then, and only then, would he rise, from beneath hill or sea, from mist or tomb or sacred fire, not to conquer, but to redeem. To finish what had been left undone on Flodden Field. But the years rolled on. Parliaments were held, treaties signed, wars fought, and no James returned. The crown passed to his infant son, James V, whose tiny hand could not yet grasp a scepter. The kingdom limped forward, mothered by Margaret Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, who now found herself a widow queen in a land that had once defied her brother. And still no grave, still no body, still no answer. Choruses sung over the tombs of the mighty, but Scotland's warrior prince, its scholar king, its Renaissance hope, vanished like breath on glass, in no statue, in no sepulchre. Only a battlefield that had devoured him whole, and a silence that never truly lifted. They called it the Black Silence. The absence that followed Flodden, a silence thicker than mourning, deeper than loss. Because what do you grieve when nothing remains? No proof, no witness, only the ache of what should have been. And in that void, legends bloom, whispers walk, and somewhere, in the mind of a nation, a king still wanders, cloaked, penitent, uncrowned. Years turned to decades. The smoke of Flodden thinned into memory, but the air never quite cleared. Too many pieces of the truth had gone missing with the king. And in that vacuum, strange things began to grow. The English kept their silence, guarded and precise. The Scots, less so. Rumors became currency, and even the poorest crofter in the far glens had an opinion on the fate of the vanished James. But it wasn't just whispers. It was sightings, events, footprints where none should be. By 1530, nearly 20 years after the battle, a name began to surface, that a figure seen wandering the cloisters of Stirling. A man in worn robes, back stooped, face half-shadowed. They called him Brother Black, not because of his garb, though it was indeed as dark as night, but because of the air about him, heavy, watchful, like winter before a storm. The first to speak of him was a nun from Linlithgow. She claimed that while in prayer, she'd seen a man kneeling before the altar long after the bells had ceased ringing, that he said nothing, did not rise. When she approached, he looked over his shoulder. And though decades had passed since Flodden, and though his beard was white and grown long, she swore the eyes were James's, burning with that same storm-racked blue. The king who had once led Scotland to war. Others followed. A smith in Dunkeld claimed a man in black robes commissioned a small dagger, paying in coins so old they were already worn smooth. At a brewer near Falkirk said the same man purchased no ale, only water, and left behind a scrap of parchment quoting Boethius in Latin. In the king's own hand, and near Perth, a frightened priest described a man who confessed to ordering the deaths of 10,000 men, weeping as he recited each name he could remember. Atonement, he said, for betrayal, for pride, and for prophecy defied. The church grew nervous. Men whispered that Brother Black was a ghost. Others, that he was a demon come to tempt Scotland from its proper path. But a few, silent, older men in courts and convents, believed something else, that James had survived. And this was him, living in shadow, walking among monks, watching his own kingdom from the outside. Why? Some said shame. Others said strategy. But most did not speak at all, because by then it was dangerous to wonder. The throne had passed on. James V now ruled, and behind him, the specter of Henry VIII loomed ever larger. The Reformation had begun. Fates fractured. The old world crumbled into fire and fury, and still, in the cloisters and lonely towers, the name Brother Black drifted like incense, unconfirmed, unchallenged, unforgotten. Then came the man in Antwerp. A stranger, cloaked in Scottish wool, arrived at the English trading house claiming to be James IV returned. It was 1540. 27 years since Flodden. He was old now, worn, but his voice was commanding, and his Latin precise. He bore a signet ring thought lost at the battlefield, and on his left hand, long presumed shattered in battle. He wore a glove that never left his skin, burned flesh, they said. A wound no physician dared remove. The English listened carefully, and though they dismissed him officially, behind closed doors there were doubts. Could it be? Could the king who had vanished have wandered Europe in disguise all these years? Could James, Renaissance monarch, rebel soul, have returned not as ruler, but as revenant? The man vanished within a month, and no trace. No corpse, no name, only a journal entry in an English spy's report. The man who calls himself James bears the bearing of kings, but walks like one already dead. In Stirling Castle, years later, a new king took up residence. James V, now grown, walked the same halls his father had, sat in the same chairs, studied the same stars. But there were nights when he claimed to see shadows that moved too slow to hear footsteps that echoed behind him where none had walked. One chambermaid swore she had seen a figure standing beneath the portcullis during a moonless night, cloaked in black, one hand gloved, the other tracing invisible runes on the stone. When she returned with the guard, there was nothing, only the scent of cold wax, and 3 coins left on the floor, minted in 1513. Asterisk by now. The myth had metastasized. Brother Black was no longer a monk, no longer a man, that he was something else. Some said he was a wraith born of royal guilt, a cursed soul, never able to die because he had never been properly buried. Others whispered of dark rites, that James had dabbled in forbidden things in the years before Flodden, that his fascination with alchemy and astrology had opened a door that never fully closed, that he had wanted to disappear, to become something more than mortal, or something less, a perpetual watcher, neither dead nor living, not king, not servant, not ghost, just there. Between. In 1590, a letter was found in the wall of an old abbey near Melrose, sealed in wax, signed only with the initials IR. Jacobus, Rex. The Latin inside read, "I left not from cowardice, but from despair. The stars told me I would not return, but never said I must die. I walk still, for I must. May the lion forgive the man." Some dismissed it as a forgery. Others believed. The abbey was burned in a storm the following year. And so we return to the riddle. Did James IV die at Flodden, as history claims? Or did he survive and simply choose silence? Is Brother Black a ghost, a king, or a creation of grief? Did Scotland lose a monarch that day, or gain a legend? The truth does not sleep easily. It shifts beneath the stones of Flodden. It lingers in the fog along the Tweed. It walks, maybe still, cloaked and gloved, down corridors that no longer exist. And every so often, when the sky is the color of iron and the bells echo too long, you might hear footsteps and feel watched. By a king who would not stay buried. They searched the battlefield long after the final cannon had silenced. When the crows rose in spirals above the slopes of Brankston Hill, the king's men moved among the broken bodies with linen and reverence. They lifted tartan and plate armor, turned faces toward the sky, and whispered names into the wind. But none could say for certain which bloodied figure, if any, had once worn the crown of Scotland. They found a body that might have been his. It was torn by blade and musket shot, the lower jaw lost, the tunic soaked dark with mud and death. Some said yes, that was him. The golden embroidery still clung to the hem, though its shape was faded, the Lion of Scotland curled in a fetal blur. Others hesitated. They had served James for years. They had seen him ride, smile, weep, rage. And this seemed too small, too quiet. The face, what remained of it, bore little resemblance to the king they had followed. Still, They wrapped the corpse in cloth, sent word to the English, and offered their grief like a toll to history. But no funeral was held in O royal burial then O. Great mourning bell tolled in the cathedrals of Stirling or Dunfermline, because soon, too soon, whispers rose in the night that James the Fourth had survived, that he had escaped through the fog, wounded but breathing, that the body they buried was a decoy, a fallen knight clothed in the king's colors, used to fool the eyes of death. And across the borderlands, the tale took root. They said he rode north on a gray mare, face wrapped in linen. He passed through the Cheviot hills with 3 companions, none of whom spoke, and disappeared into the forests near Tweed. Some claimed he lived among monks, that a hooded figure appeared at a remote priory, requesting only bread and silence. Others whispered he took ship for the continent, cloaked as a merchant, bearing nothing but a sword and a pouch of old relics, including, some believed, the bones of a saint he had once kept in his chamber for comfort. And in the Highlands, where tales grew like heather, they said the king had been seen walking the shore alone, salt on his boots and sorrow in his eyes. His crown lost, but not forgotten. There was a name for him there, the Black Pilgrim, not for the color of his clothes, but for the shadow that seemed to follow. Asterisk, and yet. Even the skeptics paused, now and then, because in the years that followed, something strange lingered in Scotland. A silence. James V, the child king, grew beneath a regency fractured by grief, but no coronation felt complete. No banner flown at. Court seemed quite full. The throne was occupied, but only half, and from time to time, riders arrived at the castles of noblemen, bearing sealed letters in unfamiliar script and signed, yet always requesting loyalty to the old blood. In Stirling, a chamberlain found fresh footprints by the chapel where James IV once prayed, though none had entered, and the door had not been opened in weeks. In the south, a farmer spoke of a tall man who blessed his child in Latin, kissed the mother's hand, then vanished into the glen like mist at dawn. And in the years that turned, like brittle pages, those stories did not fade. They sharpened, because no tomb was ever built, no bones recovered, and the crown, while passed to his son, was always referred to with a subtle edge, his father's crown. As if, even now, the true owner might return. Some scholars say it was shame that buried James, not death, that he had fled in disgrace and allowed the myth of his fall to become history's mercy. Others suggest a deeper vow, that he had received a vision before Flodden, one not of defeat, but of sacrifice. A monk's letter, found in a forgotten archive in the 1600s, claims the king once sought the counsel of a seer, an old woman near Inverness who saw shadows in the bones of birds. She told him his name would not die on the field, that he would be taken not by war, but by silence. And James, it is said, wept, because some men are not meant to die like others. Some must vanish. So the story may echo longer than the sword. Centuries passed. The battle faded into books. The monarchs changed. The language shifted. The names on maps grew unfamiliar. But in 1746, after the Jacobite rising had been crushed and Scotland bled anew, an old grave was opened in Bermondsey Abbey, where English scribes had once claimed James IV had been buried. Inside lay only dust and fragments, too little to name, too scattered to know. And so the mystery deepened, not undone, not disproven, just given breath. And still today, in the dusk around Flodden, the wind carries something more than chill. It is said that some nights, before the stars bloom fully, a rider is seen on the slope, cloaked, alone, watching no heraldry on his shield, no crown upon his brow. But he looks toward Scotland, as if listening for a voice only he can hear. And the grass stirs around him as though it remembers his name. James, the king who was, the king who might still be. Not all stories close with stone and coffin. Some drift like mist over a battlefield, never quite touched, never truly held. Some kings are buried, and some kings are simply lost. The sun hung low above the Sinai, a dull red bruise on the horizon. Its light bled softly over the golden dunes, painting the desert in long shadows and silence. There was no wind that evening, only the stillness that comes when something ancient is listening. The caravan moved like a slow, ceremonial serpent coiling across the sand. Hooves sank gently into the shifting ground. Lanterns swung from the corners of ornate litters, their glow flickering like phantom stars beneath the darkening sky. At the center of the procession rode a man wrapped in deep indigo silk, his face half hidden behind a veil of thin linen. Gold thread lined his sleeves. The ring on his right hand bore the falcon seal of Cairo's final rulers. They called him Al-Ashraf, the last Mamluk Sultan of Egypt, or so the chronicles whispered. He was not the mightiest sultan, nor the most beloved, but his name lingered longer than most. Not for battles, not for palaces, but for the way he vanished, like a breath pulled into the mouth of the desert. They say it happened in the year 1517. As the Ottomans closed their iron grip around Cairo, and the long-reigning Mamluk dynasty shuddered beneath the weight of foreign boots. The Mamluks, once fearsome slave soldiers, now bloated with ceremony and infighting, were gasping there. Last, the air in Egypt had turned heavy with omens. Al-Ashraf Tuman Bey II, crowned with reluctant hands, stood upon a crumbling throne. He had inherited smoke and blood, and very little else. There were rumors that he spoke often to mirrors, that he walked barefoot through gardens at night, that he muttered the names of long-dead sultans as if in prayer, but few truly knew the man behind the veil. His court had grown quiet, emptied of allies. The Mamluk elite distrusted his softness. The people, exhausted from years of taxation and war, looked away, and the Ottomans. They marched ever closer. It was said that Sultan Selim's soldiers moved like a black tide, 30,000 strong, ruthless and silent. After the crushing defeat at Radania, after the gates of Cairo groaned open like ribs torn wide, after the citadel was stormed and the banners fell, the Sultan was nowhere to be found, vanished, not captured, not slain, not entombed in some glorious martyr's grave, just gone. Only later did the stories begin to crawl like ivy along the ruins of his reign, that a caravan had been spotted departing Cairo by night, that it bore the Sultan, a handful of loyal men, sacred relics, and a map etched in black. It was heading east, they said, into the desert, toward the forgotten city of Isla, toward the mountains where prophets once wandered barefoot, toward the silence where ancient kings hid their gold. No one agreed on why. Some said Al-Ashraf was seeking refuge among the Bedouins. Others claimed he carried the treasury of the Mamluks, hidden in coffers under his litter, but a few, quiet few, whispered that he wasn't running at all, that he was following something, a sign, a dream, or perhaps a promise made long before his birth. They say the Sultan's mother had visions in her sleep, that she woke with sand clinging to her tongue and cried out strange names, places no longer found on any map, that she foretold her son would not die by sword or flame, but would walk into the sand and never be known again. Who listens to prophecy when the walls are crumbling? And yet, the caravan was real. Its prints were found, faint, vanishing trails heading southeast, out past the boundaries of charted land. Days later, a riderless camel was found wandering near the Gulf of Aqaba. Its saddle was scorched, its eyes empty. Then came the rest at a burned litter. Fragments of cloth, the edge of a royal seal buried half melted in the sand, but no bones, no guards, no gold in O Sultan. Only a breeze that sang in circles, and a landscape that swallowed memory like it swallows time. For centuries, storytellers in Cairo's winding alleys have repeated the tale, each one adding a thread, that the Sultan was taken by jinn, that he rode into a mirage and never returned, that he found the lost tomb of the pharaohs and chose to sleep beneath their silence. Point one version tells of a holy man who saw Al-Ashraf riding eastward beneath a burning sky. He wore no crown. He carried a scroll, and his eyes, they say, his eyes held the color of the horizon when it weeps. Could it be that the Sultan, pressured by betrayal, hunted by empire, broken by fate, had chosen to vanish? Had he hoped the desert would remember him kindly, or forget him altogether? In a world where legacies were carved in marble and defended with blades, his was a silence, a final act of refusal. But where had he gone, and why leave no trace? The sands of Sinai hold many things: fossilized shells, sun-bleached bones, echoes of ancient footsteps, but they do not give back what they take. The Bedouins who travel that route still speak of a cursed stretch of land between the Red Sea and the jagged peaks of Wadi Rum. They call it Al-Fana, the place of fading. There, compasses falter, lanterns dim without wind, and men who dream too deeply wake with sand in their mouths and forget who they are. It is said that sometimes, at the hour just before dawn, a line of camels can be seen in the distance, moving slowly against the stars, and among them, a figure cloaked in indigo, silent, watchful, as if still searching, or perhaps guiding, or perhaps waiting. No one has ever reached them, no matter how far one walks. The mirage always retreats, like a memory just beyond the edge of waking. And yet, those who've seen it say something stirs in the chest. Not fear, but longing. As if the sands remember what the world chose to forget. As if somewhere beneath the ever-shifting dunes, a sultan still walks between this world and the next. And the desert, the great eternal desert, is keeping his secret, waiting to whisper it to those who truly listen. The Sultan's trail did not vanish all at once, no. It unraveled slowly, like a scroll loosed in the wind. Even after the burned litter was found, half buried in the sand, its wood blackened, its silk torn, there remained the faintest trace of movement. A small leather satchel, found further east. A single hoofprint, too deep to be windblown, near dried out. Well, the shattered base of a brass astrolabe, crusted with salt. As if something, or someone, had continued walking. Not the whole caravan, perhaps, but one man, one rider. Was it him? Had Al-Ashraf survived the fire? Had he cast off his title, his name, and the burden of Egypt's crown, to wander the desert as a nameless soul? We cannot say, but in the years that followed, strange rumors bloomed in the silence. A manuscript discovered in the monastery of St. Catherine, written in a script unlike any known to the monks, a mixture of Mamluk court Arabic and ancient Nabatean runes. It spoke of a place called Bur al-Miraj, the Well of Ascension, said to lie hidden beyond the Valley of Serpents, where shadows move without wind and time folds like cloth. It told of a traveler, cloaked in royal blue, who came seeking the eye of God and vanished down the well. Of course, many dismissed it. The monks, half blind from candlelight and age, had little interest in royal ghosts, but others were less skeptical. In Cairo, beneath the rustling palm groves of Al-Azhar. A scholar named Ibn Safwan began to collect the tales that he compiled fragments from forgotten poets, desert songs passed down through families of camel herders, letters never delivered, and even a single page, charred at the edges, bearing what he believed was the Sultan's personal seal, that he called it the Fading Chronicle. Most historians would scoff. There were no official records after Redania. Al-Ashraf's rule ended. In conquest, his name stricken, his line erased, and yet, Ibn Safwan's work endures and whispers. One passage stands out above all. He rode beyond the reach of empire, through the mirror of flame, into the land where the sun forgets its name. What was the mirror of flame? Was it metaphor or something more? The Bedouins speak of it differently, not as poetry, but as experience. They say that once every century or so, a firestorm crosses the central Sinai, not of smoke or ash, but of light, a shimmering wave that dances just above the ground, blinding, searing, without heat. They call it Alwam, the illusion fire. Those who chase it never return. They say it hums softly, like distant drums, that it does not burn flesh, but memory. Some elders believe it is the breath of ancient gods, or the scar left behind by the fall of Iblis. But one tribe tells a tale unlike the others, that of a man in royal robes who rode straight into the heart of it. They say he never cried out, never turned, only lowered his veil, raised his eyes to the light, and was gone. Could this be the end of Al-Ashraf? Or the beginning of something else? Asterisk. In the great libraries of Istanbul, a single Ottoman dispatch survives, dated 2 seasons after the conquest of Egypt. It notes, almost in passing, that the former sultan has not been found, despite reports of his execution. Strange wording, is it not? Why mention an execution if the man was not in custody? Unless the Ottomans, too, had found the scorched remains of the caravan, and nothing more. Unless they were unsure, and deeply unsettled, for no empire, however mighty, likes a ghost wandering its borders. Asterisk. No power sleeps while knowing the rightful ruler may yet breathe under the stars. And still, time passed. Decades turned the trail to dust. And Egypt moved on. The Ottomans settled into their rule. New governors arrived. The citadel was repainted. The old coins were melted, but deep in the eastern desert, the stories did not fade. A Sufi mystic, writing in the 17th century, claimed to have met a man of noble bearing, without name, who spoke 13 languages and wept at the sound of the call to prayer. He said the man had been living among shadows and wore a cloak that bore the scent of cedar and frankincense. Could it have been him? Or had the tale become a vessel for others, a mirror in which wanderers saw themselves? Perhaps that is the secret of the Sultan's vanishing, that it left a space, a silence. One into which countless souls have stepped, seeking not a king, but the idea of one. An exile, a seeker, a man who chose mystery over monument. Could there be anything more human? For what is legacy, if not the story others tell in your absence? And what is a sultan, if not the loneliest figure in the world, bound by duty, crushed by crown, chained to history? Perhaps Al-Ashraf understood this. In those final days, before he slipped the bonds of his palace, perhaps he stood beneath the moon, as the wind kissed the banners one last time, and said to himself, I will not die for a throne. I will not be remembered for war. I will walk into the sand, and let it remember me differently. Even now, travelers speak of dreams that come while crossing the Sinai, dreams of a pale fire, of a face they cannot recall, kind, sad knowing, of footsteps beside theirs in the night, and always, always, the soft sound of hooves. just behind the wind. There is a place in the eastern reaches of Sinai where no roads lead, at a place not marked by map nor name, only by a hush that settles in the bones of those who pass near. There, amid crumbling rocks and dunes that stretch like waves frozen mid-motion, is said to lie the mouth of a forgotten wadi, and within it, a cave, cold as moonlight and dry as salt. The Bedouins call it Al-Kafiya, the hidden one, that they do not go there, nor do they speak of it often. But the stories linger, passed from grandfather to child beneath canvas tints while the tea simmers and the stars blink slowly above. It is said that once, many generations ago, a man was seen wandering near the entrance of that wadi. He did not speak. He did not drink. He simply stood, watching the horizon. When the tribesmen approached, he vanished without sound. No trace of him but a faint print in the dust, and a torn length of blue cloth snagged on a thorn bush. Was it him? Or had the tale become legend, absorbing others into its orbit, as so many desert stories do? Still, the cloth was real. It rests now in the possession of the Al-Tahawi tribe, wrapped in linen, kept in a carved box, brought out only once a year during the night of the first new moon. Children are told not to touch it, and when the box is closed, the elder always whispers, "Sleep well, Sultan." But let us step back to the time when the man himself still breathed. If Al-Ashraf Tuman Bey truly walked into the desert, if he survived the fire and the silence, what might he have thought there beneath the stars? He who once ruled from the citadel, bathed in alabaster and guarded by the roar of 1,000 soldiers, now alone, with only the wind for counsel, was he afraid or relieved? In the chronicles of the scholar Ibn Safwan, there is a peculiar passage, strange in its tone, almost poetic. He spoke to the stars as if they were his ancestors. He said, "I wore a crown of iron, and it crushed my sleep. I held the sword of state, and it cleaved my heart. I will wear only silence now, and let the sand name me." Who recorded these words? How did Safwan know them? He claims they were told to him by an old man who once served as a palace cook, a man who claimed to have seen the Sultan leave that night in Cairo, dressed not as royalty, but as a pilgrim. He bore no sword, only a small, leather-bound book, and a single white stone. The book was Quranic, according to the old man. But the stone, its meaning was never explained. Could it have been a relic? A gift from his mother? Or something older still? Some believe it was part of a lost tablet, carved in the time of Solomon, said to guide those who walk between the veils of the seen and unseen. But this is conjecture, a layer of myth atop myth. And yet, it lingers, doesn't it? This image of a man born into battle, raised in politics, crowned in fire, walking into nothingness, carrying only faith and a stone. It is not a story modern minds find easy to accept. We ask for evidence, for bones, for dates, but history does not always answer. Sometimes it smiles faintly and says, "Not yet." There are travelers, modern, skeptical, map-laden, who've tried to trace his path. Some followed the curve of the ancient spice roads. Others combed the dry channels where rivers once ran. One French explorer in the 19th century claimed to have found a medallion in a dry streambed near Petra, the same falcon seal said to belong to Al-Ashraf. But it was later dismissed as a forgery, or so the museums said. Another claimed to find a burial mound, small, humble, unmarked, in the desert north of Aqaba. Beneath the stones, a set of bones lay curled in the fetal position. Near them, a ring of blue glass. Nothing more, but, when tested, the bones revealed nothing conclusive. Too old to be his, too young to be anyone else of note. So the file was closed. The mystery set aside, and still the wind moves, still the sands shift, hiding one shape, revealing another. It has been said by the mystics and the poets alike that the desert does not forget, it may not speak, but it remembers. Perhaps that is why so many still go looking, not for treasure, not for remains, but for the hush that comes when you feel you are standing where history once passed through quietly. There are those who swear they've heard the sound of hooves in the dead of night, long after their camels were tied, and still, others speak of dreams. Too vivid, too precise. Visions of a man with soft eyes and royal hands, offering them water, then walking away before they could ask his name. He does not always speak. Sometimes he simply looks, as if waiting to see who you truly are. And then, always, he disappears. Could it be that the Sultan, even now, walks, not in flesh, no, but in memory, in symbol, in echo? Some legends are not meant to end. Some vanish, not to be forgotten, but to be found differently. To linger in stillness. The desert does not mark graves. It carries no headstones, builds no mausoleums. Only wind and shifting dunes and the long sleep of time. And perhaps that is all he ever wanted to be swallowed, not by death, but by forgetting. Yet Al-Ashraf Tuman Bey too was not forgotten. Not truly. Centuries after he vanished, his name continued to appear, not in the histories of the conquerors, but in the breath of the wind tellers, the ones who speak after the fires burn low, when only the embers remain. Some say he became a spirit of the sand, not ghost, not saint, but something in between, that when the hour before dawn stretches too long and the desert grows too still, he appears to those who carry too much, not to curse, but to guide. A flicker on the horizon, a figure beneath a pale banner of stars, not quite seen, but known. What would it mean, after all, to leave behind a crown, to forsake not only rule, but remembrance, to let your name vanish into the folds of time, not out of cowardice, but conviction? Is there a kind of courage in that, in silence? They say that in one of the old Sufi poems, rare, anonymous, ink faded like the last breath of dusk, there is a single couplet written in trembling hand. He who walks into the sun leaves no shadow behind. A riddle, perhaps, or a tribute. Or maybe the only epitaph the Sultan ever received. Some believe he was never meant to rule, that he was crowned too young, in too chaotic an age, pushed forward by those who needed a figurehead, a symbol to cling to in the tide of Ottoman conquest. And when the tides broke, he slipped free. There is no shame in choosing stillness over struggle, no dishonor in surrendering to the sand when the sword has nothing left to defend. And perhaps, just perhaps, Al-Ashraf understood this better than any of his peers. The ones who fought to the last breath were remembered in more songs. The ones who begged for clemency were footnotes in dusty ledgers. But the one who vanished? He became something else entirely. An echo, a whisper, a presence. Even now, if you listen, there are stories of a blue-veiled man seen along the old caravan roads, where no paths lied. He walks beside solitary travelers and leaves no footprints. He sits beside dying fires and leaves no ash. And sometimes, only sometimes, he speaks. They say his voice is soft, like silk caught in a breeze. He does not speak of Cairo, nor of war, nor of loss, only of stillness, of silence, of the beauty in choosing to disappear. Perhaps the Sultan did not die at all. Perhaps death was not the point. Perhaps his story was never about ending, but about return. Return to dust, to peace, to the nameless warmth of the earth. And in doing so, He became more than a king, he became a question, a hush, a flicker. A flame at the edge of the eye, just beyond reach. Just enough to make you wonder, did he die in the fire? Did he cross into legend? Or is he still out there, wandering the sands between dreams and memory, waiting for the world to become quiet enough to hear him again? We may never know. But if one day you find yourself alone in a sea of sand, the wind brushing past, your cheek like a forgotten name, and you see, far off, a line of camels beneath a dying sun, and among them, a man in indigo, veiled and watching, say nothing, walk slowly. Bow your head and listen, for the desert does not forget, and the sultan who faded in the sand may yet remember you. It began with a marriage. As so many tragedies do, the bells rang in Valladolid, their peal trailing like silk over red rooftops and dusky alleys. White petals fell from balconies. Trumpets sighed beneath balconies laced with ivy, and at the center of the spectacle, beneath a veil of soft linen and braided pearls, stood Blanche, Blanche of Bourbon, 15 years old, daughter of the House of Valois, sent across the mountains from France to Castile with a dowry of silver, a hope for peace, and the quiet, unquestioning faith of youth. She had never seen Pedro before he was 23. Already crowned, already feared, a man of sudden cruelty and uncertain charm. They called him Pedro the Just in some corners, Pedro the Cruel in others, but Blanche knew only the name and the promise of a crown. The wedding was held in the spring of 1353 in the cathedral heavy. With incense and the murmured Latin of priests, she wore white and gold. He wore crimson and steel. He kissed her hand. He took the vows, and then he left point 2 days after their wedding. Pedro disappeared. He rode south with a different woman, his mistress, Maria de Padilla, whom he had already loved for years. Some said he had secretly married her first. Blanche was left in the palace at Medina del Campo. Not a queen, not a bride, just a girl dressed in state robes, watching the sun pass over stone floors in a language she barely understood. What did she think those first nights alone? Did she wander the halls, pausing before closed doors and mirrors that no longer smiled? Did she whisper to the wind through the high windows, hoping for an answer? Or did she already know, in some quiet, shivering part of her, that she had been forgotten? The court shifted around her like a room rearranged in darkness. The Castilian nobles, bound by politics and old hatreds, turned cold. The servants spoke in hushed Castilian dialects, and Blanche's French tongue hung like a foreign ribbon in the air. Letters were written. France protested, but Pedro did not return. Weeks passed, then months. The girl queen's household grew smaller. Her world narrowed, and in time, the shutters of her chamber were drawn and barred. The official line? She was ill, delicate, withdrawn, but others whispered that she was being held, that no one was permitted to see her, not even her ladies-in-waiting, that she slept behind bolted doors, that no light was allowed to touch her skin. And then, even the whispers stopped. There is a silence in history that hums louder than words. Blanche's disappearance is one of them. She did not die in childbirth. She was not named in any known execution. No chronicler marked the hour of her death. She simply vanished. 1 year, she was Queen of Castile. The next, she was nothing. Gone from the palaces, gone from the court records, gone even from rumor, as though her presence had been scrubbed like dust from marble. And yet, in the shadows of Spain's ancient fortresses, her echo lingers. There is a chamber in the castle of Medina Sidonia, small, walled, silent. The stone is discolored in places, the ceiling low, the air thick with stillness. Local legend calls it La Camara de la Reina Triste, The room of the sad queen.it is said. She lived there, locked away, forgotten even by the guards. A pale girl dressed in white, gazing through a slit in the wall, watching birds fly free above the courtyard as her own days folded inward. There are those who claim she wrote poems on the walls, in Old French, scratched with a hairpin into the limestone. Lines like, J'étais couronné sans trône, I was crowned without a throne, but time wears all stone down, and the marks have long since faded. Still, the story lives, told in murmurs by caretakers and passed in half-truths through guidebooks. Blanche, the girl who was queen, the bride who was locked away. Did she die in that room? Was she poisoned? As some insisted, the chronicler Pero Lopez de Ayala claimed so, writing that Pedro had her put to death by a certain man named Inigo Ortiz de Estuniga. But even he confessed that no one saw her buried. No witness, no ceremony, no tomb confirmed that a body unseen is a tale unfinished. There were other versions. One swore she escaped, disguised in servant's dress, and fled north to a convent near Burgos, where she lived in silence until her hair turned white. Another claimed she was smuggled back to France, where she lived under a new name, writing letters that no one ever received. There is even a tale, whispered in the Loire Valley by old women with tired eyes, that Blanche never left at all, that she died on the castle steps, the same week as her wedding. And the woman locked in the chamber was someone else entirely. A double, a decoy, a shadow placed there to confuse the world. But why? Why preserve the image of her imprisonment? If she was already dead or already gone, perhaps because the image mattered more than the truth. A forgotten queen behind shuttered windows is a haunting symbol. A caution, a question, and somewhere, a mirror. How many others came after her? Married off, then shut away, smiled upon, then erased? Blanche's story is not loud. It carries no sword, no rebellion, no throne reclaimed, only a closed door, and the sound of footsteps fading behind it. But still, it lingers. In dark hallways, in unopened rooms, in the quiet ache of women whose names were spoken only once, then never again. And so we ask, where did Blanche of Bourbon go? Did she die with a whisper or live beneath a borrowed name? And why? Do we still feel her presence when we pass shuttered windows in old stone towers? The bells had barely ceased, echoing across the stone battlements when Blanche of Bourbon realized the sound she most longed to hear would never come. Not a single footstep approached her chamber that night. No servant with wine, no handmaid bearing gifts from a husband's hand, no king. Pedro had vanished like morning dew in summer, present just long enough to be noticed, then gone before the heart could understand the loss. The women around her, Castilian courtiers with painted eyes and clipped voices, said little. They offered bland smiles, courteous nods, but beneath it all, silence. A silence that crept around Blanche like frost around a window pane. Chill, still, watching. On the second morning of her queenship, she sent a letter to the king. She waited. The reply never came. Instead, news came with the thunder of hooves that it was not a royal envoy, nor a nobleman bearing a message of joy. It was a whisper, louder than truth. King Pedro had taken another woman, not weeks or months after his marriage, but hours. The people murmured the name like a ghost shadow. Maria de Padilla, no Lady of France. No queen crowned in golden halls. She was of lesser blood, yes, but she had something Blanche never did to Pedro's favor. His memory, perhaps even his soul. Blanche's new court, small and hollow, began to shrink. Invitations stopped. Dinners went uneaten. Maids averted their eyes. The golden embroidery on her sleeves seemed heavier. Like chains, she stood each day at the high window of the Alcazar, watching the birds trace circles across the summer sky. Was she still a bride, she wondered, or a widow? Yet it was not death. That separated them. It was indifference. And indifference, in its own way, can be far crueler, Blanche wrote again. Not to Pedro, this time to her cousin, King Charles of France. Her words were careful, sorrowful, laced with the subtle cry of one imprisoned without bars. Her cousin's court stirred. In Paris and Avignon, tongues wagged. Had Castile spurned? France? Had the blood of Bourbon been insulted? The Pope himself took notice. Diplomats rode south in a river of velvet and protest. But Pedro remained unmoved. That he spoke of politics, not love. Claimed Blanche had betrayed him by siding with his enemies. Whispered that her dowry had never been paid in full. A king's excuses, but not a husband's. Soon, Blanche's letters were read. Less in courts and more in shadows. She had become a symbol, yes, but symbols are rarely heard. The queen's chamber grew colder, not in temperature, but in tone. Day by day, candles disappeared. The great mirror once gifted to her by a French noble was removed. No reason given. Even her maids were changed, new faces. Silent ones. They smiled with no warmth and folded her gowns without words. When she asked to visit the chapel, the doors remained locked. When she asked to walk the gardens, she was told the weather was poor, though the sky gleamed blue. What, then, had her marriage bought her? A crown, perhaps, but a crown carved of air, and behind the Alcazar's thick walls, the echoes of footsteps. She no longer recognized point one day. Without warning, Blanche was moved, not to a summer palace, not to another wing, but to a place whose very name seemed to sink beneath the tongue, Medina Sidonia. There, behind thick shutters and vine-choked walls, Blanche was sealed away, not in iron, nor with chains, but with time, and with absence. No more letters, no visitors. Even the birds stopped circling her windows. She walked the cold halls like a candle burning low, flickering with memory, fading with silence. Was it months? Years? The records blur like ink left in rain. Her name stopped appearing in court documents. Royal proclamations bore her title, and in Pedro's chronicles. She ceased to exist. But silence, you see, has many voices. In Seville, they whispered that she had gone mad. In Burgos, they said she had taken holy vows, living as a nun in some remote monastery. And in Toledo, where firelight dances long into the night, they murmured of a darker ending, that she had been quietly poisoned in public mourning. No tomb unveiled, just a gradual vanishing, like mist melting into the stones. But if she died, where, then, was her grave? Centuries passed, and tombs were opened, some claiming to hold the bones of Blanche of Bourbon. Point one, in Medina Sidonia, bore a woman's remains. But the inscriptions were vague, almost reluctant. Another, in a quiet chapel near Jerez, was said to hold a queen who had suffered much and died in grace. Yet no seal bore her name, and no record dared declare it final. It was as though the land itself had agreed to forget her. To swallow her tale in sand and time. And still, on certain nights, when the wind coils low through Castilian halls, they say a woman's steps can be heard, moving slowly, carefully, as if afraid of waking the walls. Her story never shouted. It simply remained, like dust in the corners of an empty room, or a letter never sent. Was she a prisoner? A martyr? A woman erased? Or merely a name caught in a war not of her making? The shuttered chamber held many answers, but none were ever spoken aloud. And Blanche, the woman who was queen for a day, continued to walk through silence that a ghost without, a grave a wife without a wedding. And still, she waited, perhaps not for rescue, but simply to be remembered. The years crept onward, as years do in stone-bound rooms where silence thickens and time forgets its pace. The wars in Castile thundered on without her name. Outside the shuttered walls, men rode and died for flags, and grudges for vengeance and honor. But within that old fortress where Blanche of Bourbon was last seen, only the hush of dust and the cold rustle of wind remained in the annals of diplomacy. There was no correction, no retraction, no formal notice. The Bourbon princess had not been publicly divorced, nor was she ever formally widowed. In the eyes of France, her status lingered, suspended like a breath never exhaled, and so France watched, quietly, politely, and waited. Blanche's cousin, Charles V, now King of France, had not forgotten her. No one in the court of Paris had. Her marriage had been a national contract, one signed in good faith and blessed by Pope and Crown alike. To have her vanish, quite literally from the page, was an insult not merely to her dignity, but to the diplomatic web of Europe itself. Yet, Pedro offered no explanation. He sent no reply to France's embassies that no death notice, no scandal, just silence. Thick and deliberate. 1 year passed. Then 2. Still, the court chroniclers had nothing to amend, and in that vacuum, rumors were born. Some whispered that Blanche had taken her own life in despair. Others swore that she still lived, hidden within the darkened tower of Siguenza, or perhaps moved to another remote keep where none could find her. A nun who once served in Tordesillas claimed the queen had been relocated in secret, dressed as a commoner, spirited away beneath the cover of night. Some stories were crueler. One servant confessed, under duress, that she had seen poison smuggled into the tower. Another told of a meal brought by a mute boy, after which Blanche was never seen again. But none of these confessions held firm. They dissolved under scrutiny. The names changed. The dates blurred. Truth had become quicksand, treacherous, and without bottom. And still, Pedro said nothing. That he ruled as if Blanche had never existed. His attentions remained fixed upon Maria de Padilla, the woman he had chosen even before the Bourbon bride had set foot on Spanish soil. Their union had been quiet, unofficial, and yet more binding than any crown ceremony. Some say Maria bore him children. Others claim she guided his rule from the shadows, a queen in all but name. And when she died, years later, unexpectedly and still young, Pedro ordered that she be buried as a queen, and only then revealed that he had married her in secret all along. As for Blanche, there was no such proclamation, and no posthumous elevation, no chapel or mass, no stone cut in her name. And so, the Bourbon queen became a silence etched in memory, a woman with no ending. But whispers never sleep for long. In the north, among the merchant ports and mountain passes, travelers began to speak of a French woman glimpsed in the company of nuns, always guarded, her hair veiled, her name never spoken. Aloud, she walks like a noble, one merchant said, but her eyes are hollow. Others spoke of a cloistered abbey where a woman of regal bearing kept her own cell, tended by sisters who refused all questions. A passing bishop, curious, once asked her name. He was shown the door before dawn. In Castile, the nobility grew uneasy. Even those loyal to Pedro feared the shadow of Blanche's memory. It was one thing to cast aside a queen, but another to allow her ghost to linger. And then, in a twist of fate, an old enemy returned. Henry of Trastamara, Pedro's half-brother, had fled Castile years before. Branded a rebel, a traitor, he had taken refuge in France and then in Aragon. But Henry was patient, and he was not without allies among them. The very kingdom that had once wed Blanche to Pedro, France had not forgiven the insult, and neither had Charles V. In 1366, Henry returned to Castile with a mercenary army, 1,000 strong. The mercenaries, called the Free Companies, were hard men, veterans of the Hundred Years' War, led by Bertrand du Guesclin, one of France's most cunning captains. They crossed the Pyrenees like a tide of steel and fire. Their cause? To depose the king who had dishonored Blanche of Bourbon. Their banner? Justice for Castile and vengeance for the queen who had vanished. As Henry marched south, towns opened their gates. Castilian nobles, long weary of Pedro's brutality, changed sides. Even his allies began to falter. Pedro fled before them, seeking refuge in the fortress city of Burgos, and for a moment, it seemed the wheel of fate had turned. But Blanche's name, strangely, was not on their banners that it had been years since anyone had seen her. Her face was no longer painted on the walls of power. Even her enemies could not decide whether she had died in obscurity or if, somehow, she had escaped her fate entirely. One night, in a chapel taken by Henry's forces, a soldier found a small portrait tucked beneath the altar cloth, faded with age, water-stained. It bore the likeness of a young woman in French court attire. No one knew who had placed it there, but many believed it was Blanche. Then, like fire catching dry fields, war swept Castile once more. Pedro regained allies, chief among them Edward the Black Prince of England, who saw in Pedro a bulwark against French influence. Together they drove Henry's army back, retaking much of the kingdom. In the shadow of this struggle, Blanche's story was nearly forgotten again, but only nearly, for those with quiet ears. Her tale still stirred behind palace doors that a courtier claimed to have seen a woman weeping in the old fortress of Medina Sidonia, veiled and pale, guarded as if her life were currency. A physician's ledger from Burgos recorded a dose of laudanum, given to a Lady Blanca, suffering from fainting spells. But the entry was scratched out, erased, nothing confirmed, nothing solid. Even the priests were divided. Some said she had died in 1361, poisoned, perhaps. Others argued for 1363, or even later. Yet there was no burial record, no chapel mass held in her name. The crown never paid for her soul's salvation, and so the mystery stretched on, unspoken, unresolved, that a queen made ghost not by death, but by neglect. Eventually, the tides of war turned for the final time. Pedro was defeated, trapped, killed in a final confrontation with his half-brother Henry, stabbed to death. It was said, after a tense parley turned violent, Henry ascended the throne as Henry II, and Castile changed. But Blanche's story remained in the margins, not erased, not remembered, simply suspended. If history itself could not decide whether she was meant to be remembered as a woman, a martyr, or a myth. And in that fog of uncertain endings, a final rumor took root. They say that, after Henry claimed the crown, he sent men to search the countryside, to find Blanche's remains and grant her the burial of a queen. But nothing was found. No bones, no tomb, no stone with her name. Only a single silver mirror, buried in an old trunk in a shuttered room. Its glass was cracked, but inside the lid, etched in the corner, were words in French asterisk, Je suis toujours la reine. I am still the queen. There is a certain hush that settles over ruins. Not silence, but something deeper. A knowing. The stones remember, even if the scribes forget. And in the old corners of Medina del Campo, they remember her, the French queen who was not a queen, the wife who was never truly wed, the ghost who never truly died. Whispers say Blanche's final days passed not in grandeur, but in shadows. No court, no crown, no attendants, just a threadbare bed in a dim room, guarded more from memory than from men. What thoughts must have curled through her mind as the seasons turned and the world went on without her? Was she still that girl from the House of Bourbon, brought across the Pyrenees in bridal silks, her lips trembling with vows that had never been answered? Or had she become something else? A woman turned to iron by betrayal and time. No one knows. They say the door to her chamber stayed closed for years. That even after she vanished, whether by death or flight, no one dared live in that room. Maids claimed they heard quiet sobbing through the stone at night. Not loud, not pleading, just the breath of grief caught between walls. Some said the sobbing stopped when the winds blew east, as though Blanche had followed them. Was she poisoned, then? By Pedro's hand, or by another's ambition? An apothecary from Cuenca, writing decades later, claimed a recipe of bitter almonds and wine had been prepared for a pale lady with blue eyes. But who the lady was, he would not say. The Castilian court made no formal announcement of her death. No funeral, no tomb, no widow's procession. Pedro, ever distracted by war and desire, soon shifted attention. By 1366, he had greater enemies than ghosts. His half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, rose with French and Aragonese backing, seeking to claim Castile by force. The land trembled with civil war, and the memory of Blanche was swept aside like dust before a storm. And yet, in the chaos of that war, a curious story emerged that a merchant caravan, fleeing Leon during the fighting, reported a strange encounter near the banks of the Douro. An old woman, wrapped in a servant's cloak, her hair dyed dark, had approached them, asking for passage. She spoke fluent Castilian, but with a soft French lilt. She wore rings too fine for her station, and when asked her name, she only smiled and said, "I was once beloved by none and mourned by many." They did not take her in, but some swore the trees bowed in the wind as she passed. Was it Blanche? Had she escaped, at last, trading a prison for the open road, royalty for obscurity? We do not know. Many decades later, during renovations of an old convent in Medina del Campo, a chamber was unsealed. Within it, a single carved chair faced a window of colored glass. On the wall hung a tapestry, faded with age. A Bourbon lily, barely visible, still lingered in its threads. There was no body, just silence. Some claimed that Blanche had taken vows and lived out her days as a cloistered nun. Others said she had wandered north, dying nameless in a border. Village Point One legend speaks of a grave, marked only by a cross of iron, hidden in a shepherd's meadow near Burgos. The iron, they say, rusted but never fell. Perhaps that's all she wished in the end. Not remembrance, but rest. Historians debate her fate still. Some argue over poisoned dates and court ledgers. Others search for her name in tax records and cloisters. But her story resists conclusion. It slips through fingers like the shadow of a bird passing over stone. And in the cathedrals of France, where her kin once knelt, her name is etched quietly on a wall of forgotten daughters. Blanche de Bourbon, Épouse de Castile, Mort sans Paix. Blanche of Bourbon, wife of Castile, died without peace. But perhaps that's not quite true. Perhaps, in the hush between centuries, in the folds of time where memory softens, she found what Castile never gave her. Not a crown, not justice, but the last grace of being no longer hunted by sorrow, just gone. The chamber remains shuttered, and the woman who was queen remains a story whispered never answered. The sun rose softly over Antananarivo that morning, though no one noticed. A hush had settled over the red hills, and the old royal palace stood as though holding its breath. The city, once a kingdom's heart, now beat under a foreign rhythm, slower, colder, unfeeling. It was February 28th, 1897. And Queen Renavalona III was preparing to vanish, not in death. Not yet, but in something stranger. In the way that fog disappears from a mirror, leaving no trace it was ever there. She rose before the dawn bells. Her bed had barely creased. She had not slept. Not really. How could she, with her land slipping away grain by grain, taken by men who never learned her language but claimed her soil? They were outside now. French soldiers, not enemies with spears or drums, but men in polished boots who watched her like one might study a fading relic in a glass case. Curious, distant, vaguely respectful, but ultimately disinterested. She walked to the balcony of the Manjikamiadana palace. From here, she could see the roofs of the capital, red clay tiles, some still thatched, others newer under French influence. She had been queen over them all once. Not merely a title, but a mother to the nation. Now she was a queen of ashes. The scent of ylang ylang and river water drifted faintly on the breeze, mixing with the dust. There were no weeping crowds, no songs of farewell. The people had been warned to stay silent. Even sorrow was now forbidden her. Handmaidens, those few still permitted to remain, dressed her in a gown chosen by the French. Not her royal lamba, not the silk wraps of Marina queens, but a stiff Western dress, dark and cumbersome, as though mourning herself in advance. One of the maids, Rizoa, who had served her since childhood, combed her hair in silence at Ranavalona's. Eyes did not glisten. She had trained herself too well. Dignity, always. Grace, even in defeat. But as Rizoa pinned the final comb in place, an heirloom of ivory once gifted by Queen Rezaharina, her hands trembled. "Do you want to take it?" Rizoa whispered. Ranavalona stared into the mirror. A queen stared back, but only just. Her face, still youthful, carried the wear of 1,000 betrayals. Eyes too wise, lips too still. "No," she said quietly. "It belongs here. I do not." By mid-morning, the carriage was readied. It wasn't the royal procession she had known. No heralds, no flags. Just a black coach and 4 horses brought in from Algeria. The French governor, General Gallieni, was waiting. He offered a stiff nod as she approached. She returned it. He spoke in practiced Malagasy. "Your Majesty, the boat waits in Tomadov. From there, to Reunion. And then, wherever the government decides." She did not answer. To speak would be to grant them the last word. Instead, she stepped into the carriage. Inside, the air was stale. One window cracked slightly open. She could hear the hooves, the murmurs of soldiers, the tightening of reins. And just before they moved, she looked once more at the hilltop palace behind her, Manjikamiadana, the fine place of sovereignty. Built in stone and wood by her ancestors, it now stood hollowed, its soul stripped. Somewhere within its halls were the bones of queens. Ranavalona I, the Iron Lady. Rezo Harina, the widowed phoenix. They had held off the world with spears and strategy. Ranavalona III? She had fought with treaties, with diplomacy, with delay, and when all else failed, with quiet refusal. It had not saved the kingdom, but it had preserved something. As the carriage jolted into motion, she whispered something beneath her breath. A prayer? A farewell? No one heard it. Outside, children watched from rooftops. Women pressed hands to their chests. But none spoke, not because they didn't love her, but because they feared what loving her might cost. The journey was long. From Antananarivo down through the valleys and rivers, across ridges where the fog clung like regret. At night, the queen refused the comfort of inns. She slept sitting upright, wrapped in a blanket stitched by her mother long ago, and all the while, her journal stayed closed. She had always written. Always. Even in the dark days after the French invasion. But now, her pen rested. There would be no more entries. No final page. Not even a signature by the time they reached the port of Tamatov. The rain had begun to it wasn't the cleansing kind. It felt like memory, slow, unrelenting. On March 1st, she boarded the ship. The tricolor flag of France snapped overhead. The Malagasy standard was gone. As the vessel pulled from the shore, she stood on deck, veiled in black. That a journalist, sent to record the departure, described her as serene, but unknowable, like marble left in the sun. That was the last confirmed sighting of her as queen. The last day she stood as a figure of a sovereign people. The ship would take her to Réunion Island, then to Algeria, then to Paris, and then nothing. A slow, soft descent into absence. The woman who had ruled Madagascar, who had faced down colonizers with poise and restraint, would soon become something else. That a quiet guest, a curiosity, a shadow in lace gloves, until she simply disappeared. The winter of 1901 settled softly over France. Snow on slate roofs, ashen skies that never quite broke into sun. In the small seaside town of Algiers, under French protectorate rule, a pale figure stood at the balcony of a rented villa. Her dark eyes, widened by memory and dulled by exile, searched the waves as if they might carry word from a vanished world. Renovalona III, daughter of Ambatomanoina, queen of Madagascar no longer. Her palace had been taken, her flags lowered, but her silence, her poise, remained untouched. She was, in the eyes of the French, no longer a monarch, just a native guest, a curiosity, a symbol, a living remainder of something they believed they had erased. And yet, she continued to dress each morning in silks from her homeland. She braided her hair in the old ways. She lit candles at dusk and whispered prayers in Malagasy beneath her breath. Did she still feel like a queen? Or had the quiet erosion of identity already begun? The French did not kill her. Not openly. They did something slower. They made her disappear. Not all at once, but in fragments. First, her court was dissolved. Then, her letters began returning unopened. Her advisors reassigned. Her ladies-in-waiting sent home. The queen was moved from Algiers to Nice, then from Nice to Marseilles. Always under watch, never quite imprisoned, but never truly free. They said it was for her protection. They said she was ill. They said many things, and none of them quite explained the sorrow on her face. Letters from the queen dwindled over time. At first, she wrote regularly to those few allies she had in Europe. One or two missionaries, a distant cousin, an English abolitionist woman who had once met her in Antananarivo. But then, in the early spring of 1903, her handwriting changed at an O. Longer, strong, and slanted, it became hesitant, frail, as if the paper resisted her touch. And then, it stopped altogether. No note. No goodbye, just silence. What could have happened? Was it illness? A quiet passing behind velvet curtains. Some said she had grown weary and gone mad. That she believed the spirits of the highlands had followed her to France. That she saw them in mirrors, heard them in the rustle of trees outside her window. Others claimed the French had moved her yet again, to a place so remote, so secret, that even they had forgotten where she was kept. There were whispers of a convent, a hospital, a private estate on Corsica, but none of these were proven. No photographs, no death certificate. no grave. Only the trail going cold. A maid once claimed she had seen the queen boarding a train from Lyon in the middle of the night, alone and heavily veiled. Another spoke of a woman who resembled her, living quietly under another name in the countryside, speaking to no one but the birds. Still another story, perhaps the strangest, came from an old French diplomat who had known her in her youth. He insisted she had escaped entirely, sailed away in disguise on a merchant ship bound for Zanzibar, and that she had lived the remainder of her days walking barefoot through forests and villages, unknown to any, unseen by all but the moon. Was it fantasy? Or something darker? Renavalona had once ruled an island kingdom of rainforests and red hills. Now, her legacy was scattered like the dust of parchment. French schoolchildren were taught she had surrendered. Colonial reports insisted she had been treated with honor and comfort, but there were no official records after 1903. No obituary, no tomb, just a few fading photographs, a handful of stitched linens in a museum, and silence where a sovereign had once stood. But why would the French have wanted her forgotten? Perhaps they feared what she symbolized. Ranavalona was not a conqueror, not a warrior, but she was persistent. She held the eyes of a people who remembered what freedom felt like. She knew the sacred songs. She remembered the smell of lemongrass in the palace gardens. She had seen, in her youth, the last sacred stone carried across the hills, and though she sat quietly in the salons of her captors, there was something unbroken in her. Maybe they feared that even one unbroken soul could undo what canons and contracts had claimed. By the time the First World War began, no mention of her remained. Newspapers turned to louder things: kings and empires, trenches and gas. But back in Madagascar, there were still some who sang the Queen's name during funerals, still some who lit oil lamps and whispered her spirit home at dusk. They said the French could not find her, because she had passed into the forests that she lived now among. The ancestors, feeding the earth, walking on winds, silent and watchful. And when the wind passed through the tamarind trees near the royal hill of Ambohimanga, some said it carried her voice, soft and unbowed. What is a queen? When her crown is gone, is she still royal in exile? Still sacred when stripped of gold and pageantry? Or is her silence her final act of power? Ranavalona left no heir, no will, no known resting place, and yet her name lives on in whispers.in. Mystery.in, questions left deliberately unanswered. The streets of Algiers held a beauty that seemed too bright for the sorrow it was about to hold. Pale villas shimmered under the Mediterranean sun. Bougainvillea curled like blood-colored veins across whitewashed walls. But inside one such villa, far from home, far from purpose, the last queen of Madagascar sat in stillness. Ranavalona III had now lived more than a decade in exile. The days had grown patterned, quiet. Letters from Madagascar arrived less often. Gifts from the colonial government had dwindled to gestures. The French Republic no longer needed to parade its captured royalty. The novelty had passed. She was now less a queen, and more the memory in a rented room that in 1901 she had been moved. From Paris to Algiers. They called it a climate better suited for her health. But everyone knew what it meant. She was being tucked away, like a painting too large for the drawing room. Still valuable, still delicate, but not convenient. With her went her cousin, Razendranoro, and the ever-faithful niece, Ramacindrazana. The palace retinue had shrunk to 3. Even her guards, once assigned to her day and night, were reduced to a single presence outside the villa gates. Algiers was warm and beautiful and utterly foreign. Here, she was no longer an object of study, nor a threat, just a woman in widow's silks, walking the citrus grove, writing letters few would answer. Some days, she took to embroidery. Other days, she stared out over the sea, her gaze fixed not on the waves, but on the vast silence that stretched beyond them. Visitors came less frequently now. Once, a former colonial officer brought her clippings from French newspapers, the latest policies, wars, fashion. She looked at them gently, then folded them away. There was nothing in the world outside that still held her name. Nothing, save the distant memory of a stolen throne and the echo of drums that had long since fallen quiet. Back in Madagascar, stories of her still floated between markets and hillsides. That she would return, that she was simply resting. That one day, the foreigners would flee, and she would rise again from the hills of Antananarivo, crowned in gold and fire. Children sang old songs about the queen with heavy eyes. They didn't know her face, but they whispered her name. Here in Algiers, however, her name was barely spoken. That a letter from a Malagasy priest in 1905 reached her hands, carried over weeks across land and sea. He wrote, "The people ask where you are. I tell them you are, watching over them from afar." Ranavalona wrote back only, "Tell them I still breathe." But even that, even breath, was becoming quieter. Her health had begun to fade. The Algerian doctor assigned to her noted fatigue, low appetite, melancholy, but she refused laudanum, refused rest, refused to be pitied. "I am not sick," she once told Razendranoro. "I am only misplaced." The French administrators weren't cruel, not precisely, but they were bureaucratic, tidy. They gave her allowances. They made sure the garden was maintained. But they no longer wrote her name in reports, no longer invited her to balls. She was, to them, a solved problem. A queen without a crown, a page turned in the great ledger of empire. And so, the months passed. The sea rose and fell. The lemons ripened and fell. Her letters thinned. Her voice, too. There were fewer walks in the garden, fewer visitors, until at last, the house stood quiet most days, just the rustling of her silks down the hall, the sound of birds outside the shuttered windows, and the hush of time passing, without witness. And then, one day, even the footsteps stopped. The spring of 1917 drifted gently into the outskirts of Algiers, carrying the faint perfume of citrus groves and the hush of distant waves lapping the Mediterranean shore. But within the pale walls of a borrowed villa, the last queen of Madagascar sat still. Ranavalona III was now 46. No longer exiled royalty making rounds in Parisian salons. No longer even a figure of novelty to colonial hosts. Time had reduced her to a shadow, not yet old, but entirely faded. She rarely left the garden. She rarely wrote letters. And even her entourage, the ever-loyal Ramachandrazana and Razendranoro, had learned to speak less, to move lightly, to fold themselves into the silence of a house that belonged to no one. Asterisk, and then she simply disappeared. It began not with an announcement, but with an absence. A local postmaster noticed her name missing from incoming mail. A grocer down the hill asked why her cook had not come for fruit. The French authorities, already occupied with the growing tremors of the First World War, barely registered the concern. Some said she had fallen ill, quietly and swiftly. Others whispered that she had asked for no doctors, no ceremony, no attention at all. That one morning, she simply stayed in bed, her breath slipping from her as softly as her kingdom had. But no one saw her body. No public notice was issued. No official funeral was held. Instead, and strangely, the news came months later from Paris. That a newspaper published a short note. La reine est morte. The queen is dead. No photograph, no details, and when reporters inquired further, The ministries replied with confusion. Some said she had died in March. Others said July. One clerk, flustered, claimed he thought she was still alive. There was no grave in Algiers. No procession. No official record released to the public. What did exist, quietly, was a stone inn. The St. Eugene Cemetery. A small, barely marked plaque, placed near the corner wall, behind a row of foreign dignitaries long forgotten. It bore her name. But even that was debated. The stone read, Renavalo Manjaka III. Not her full title, not even her proper spelling. Some Malagasy visitors, decades later, claimed it was not hers at all, that the queen had been moved, or perhaps never buried at all. In Madagascar, legends blossomed like night-blooming flowers, that she had escaped her handlers, that Razendranoro helped her flee to a monastery in Corsica, that she had lived for years under an assumed name, weaving tapestries in a quiet coastal town. Some claimed she had returned, in secret, to the Red Island, that she was buried beneath the sacred baobabs, in a tomb known only to her bloodline, that each year, on the date of her death, unconfirmed though it remained, a red scarf appeared on the palace steps in Antananarivo. But those were whispers. Always whispers. What remained was stillness, a stillness that settled not only over her memory, but over the entire Malagasy court in exile. After Ranavalona vanished, so too did her cousin Razendranoro. One letter survived from her, dated 1919, addressed to an unknown sister. After that, silence. Ramachandrazana, the last of the royal entourage, lingered in France for a few more years. She died in obscurity, in a modest boarding house outside Nice, and no monuments were raised. No ceremonies remembered. The French Republic had moved on. The colonial system had shifted. The war had consumed the attention of Europe, and Madagascar, long colonized, was now no longer spoken of in imperial salons, but across the sea, in the hills of Imarina, old women still murmured her name, still remembered her as New York Panjikavavi, the queen who never returned. They said she walked softly, that her gaze was deep, that her voice, though quiet, could still the room. They said her spirit remained not in palaces or graves, but in the fog that clung to the highland mornings, in the hush between rainfalls, in the hush of things never truly ended. And so, Ranavalona III passed into history, not with a death, but with a vanishing NO portrait painted her final hour. No page held her last words, only silence, vast and weightless, and the memory of a woman who once wore a crown and later became a question. Where did the last queen go? Into the sea? Into the mist? Into the folds of time? Or does she still wander, in some shape unseen, a whisper beneath the silk folds of dusk, a presence in the places forgotten? No one truly knows. And that, perhaps, is how queens become legend, not by the power they held, but by how quietly they vanish and how long the silence echoes after. It began with smoke, thin, almost ceremonial, curling into the night air above the royal grounds of Naryanhiti Palace. But it was no incense, and the bells that echoed through Kathmandu that evening were not calling the faithful to prayer. They were ringing for blood. That on the 1st of June, 2001, the silence of Nepal's royal family shattered in a single evening, shattered like a pane of glass struck by something sudden and final. The monarchy, centuries old, revered and distant, suffered a wound so deep that its edges were never quite found again. And in the hours that followed, a strange, almost dreamlike phrase would begin to drift through the Himalayan air. King Dipendra. But Dipendra was in a coma. He had no crown upon his head, no throne beneath him. His breath was labored, his eyes shut, and yet somehow, He was king, a silent king in a country that had gone suddenly voiceless. And so the story begins, not with the coronation of a ruler, but with a massacred, the Naryanhidi royal palace, long forbidden to common eyes, was built like a labyrinth, its walls thick and expressionless, its doors sealed, and its chambers echoing with secrets. Within, the royal family of Nepal had lived for generations in a state of both splendor and shadow. They were revered by many as divine, descendants of Vishnu himself, but divinity had done little to protect them from what would unfold that night. At the heart of the palace grounds stood the Tribhuvan Sudan, a guest house used for family banquets. That evening, the royal family had gathered for a monthly dinner. It was not formal, not political, merely an effort, it was said, to strengthen fraying bonds. There had been disagreements, rumors of tension, whispers that Crown Prince Dipendra was growing restless, angry. But few expected the gathering to end in bloodshed. Few imagined the quiet prince could become something else. Dipendra was intelligent, that much all agreed upon. Educated in England, military trained, a fan of motorbikes and martial arts. But he had also become known for a temper that flared, then simmered beneath the surface like magma beneath stone. Those closest to him spoke of pressure, of a young man trapped between two worlds, tradition and modernity, duty and desire. And there was the matter of Devyani Rana, the woman he loved and could not marry. Devyani came from a noble family. Yes, but not one approved by his parents, especially his mother, Queen Aishwarya, who believed in a lineage of purity, of propriety. Her vision for Nepal's monarchy did not include Devyani, and Dipendra? He rebelled, quietly at first, then not so quietly on that final day of May. Something in him had begun to unravel. According to later reports, Dipendra arrived at the dinner drunk. That much was repeated, but what happened next differs, depending on who is speaking. Some say he excused himself after an argument with his mother. Others recall him leaving with an eerie calm, retreating to his private quarters. What followed was a silence, and then gunfire, rapid, close, not the sort heard on Kathmandu's streets, but controlled, trained, deliberate. Guests were shot where they stood. King Birendra, Dipendra's father, reportedly raised his hand to stop the shooter and was gunned down. Queen Aishwarya tried to shield another. Prince Nirajan, Dipendra's younger brother, fell near a set of marble stairs. Witnesses recall bodies crumpling on rugs, on polished floors, blood mingling with candlelight, and then nothing. When the gunfire ceased, the silence that followed was deeper than before. Dipendra was found in the garden, unconscious. A self-inflicted gunshot to the head, but he was breathing. The very man who had allegedly orchestrated and executed the royal massacre had survived. Though unconscious, he remained alive for 3 more days. And in that brief window, Nepal entered one of the strangest chapters in its modern history. For on the morning of June 2nd, while lying in a coma, Dipendra was proclaimed King of Nepal. The crown passed to a man whose mind could no longer receive it. A nation wept, and yet watched in a kind of stunned silence. Some grieved, others murmured disbelief. Still others whispered questions. How had a single man done this? How had he obtained such weapons and evaded so many guards? And if he had truly taken his own life, why had he left the job unfinished? The investigation, swift and shrouded, offered a theory, but little resolution. A 9-member committee declared Dipendra guilty of the massacre. They cited his frustrations, his argument with the queen, his desire to marry Devyani, his emotional state. But the inquiry was conducted hastily. It lasted only 2 weeks. Some key witnesses were not interviewed. Others, silenced by fear or formality, and no international observers were permitted. No forensic review released. Documents vanished. Ballistic reports were buried. And the exact sequence of events, who was shot first, when the guards reacted, whether Dipendra acted alone, remained a patchwork of contradictions that a fog settled over the truth. And there, it stayed. Outside the palace, Nepal changed. The people mourned, but also doubted. Many refused to believe Dipendra capable of such violence. Others believed he had been framed. Theories multiplied, some claiming a larger conspiracy, a coup in disguise. Some claimed agents from abroad had infiltrated the palace. Others spoke of internal rivalries deep within the royal court. There were those who insisted Dipendra was dead, but others were not so sure. Stories began to spread, faint, impossible ones, that the real Dipendra had escaped, that a body double had taken his place, that the wounded prince had been smuggled out of the city under cover of night, spirited away, to the mountains or beyond, into the hollow mountain. Some whispered that a place in legend, unreachable, hidden in the folds of Himalayan rock and snow, where lost kings waited. But the truth had gone still. On June 4th, the official announcement came. King Dipendra had died, still in coma. His uncle, Gyanendra, was declared the new king, and the nation entered a deeper silence. The royal family, once seen as the very breath of Nepalese identity, had been reduced in a single night. From divine rulers to victims, from victims to questions, and from questions to myth. Today, the Narayana Palace stands as a museum. Visitors walk its empty halls, past wax figures and exhibits, guided by placards that speak in hushed, polished tones. But the room where the massacre occurred? The garden where Dipendra was found? Those are not on display. They remain shuttered. And somewhere in the folds of memory, in old family homes, in the highlands, in fading newspaper clippings and dreams, the image of Dipendra still lingers, not as a murderer, not as a martyr, but as a mystery. One not buried, but hidden. The aftermath began not with answers, but with absence, in absence that spread like ink through water, quietly, slowly, until the fabric of Nepalese society seemed touched by it. The massacre at Narayana had not just ended lives. It had disrupted time itself. The clock that had ticked in rhythm with the monarchy for centuries now stuttered, uncertain whether to move forward or backward. And amidst it all stood a strange truth, barely spoken aloud. A king had ruled while unconscious. It had never happened before, and it would never happen again. For those close to the palace, June 2001 passed in a blur of whispered condolences and tight-lipped ceremonies. The state funeral, though attended by foreign dignitaries and watched across the world, felt muted, partly by grief, partly by confusion. 10 members of the royal family had died. Among them, a reigning king and queen, a prince, and other senior royals. The crowd that lined the funeral route wept. But they also stared, not with reverence, as before, but with searching eyes. They were trying to read between the gestures, the chants, the pages of history being turned too fast. Some carried photographs of Dipendra, not with hatred, but with hope. Hope that the truth had not yet surfaced. What if he hadn't pulled the trigger? What if he had tried to stop it? What if the truth had been buried with the wrong man? The questions lingered in tea stalls and university cafes, in the mouths of cab drivers and retired soldiers. Rumors surfaced in quiet corners of Kathmandu. Small inconsistencies in the official report were passed around like contraband, that a rifle too heavy for Dipendra to carry alone, wounds that did not align with known positions, missing footage from palace security cameras, and then The peculiar detail of the crown itself, the coronation of Dipendra, done in absentia while he lay comatose, had been symbolic, yes, but it was done hastily and in private. No official photos, no religious ceremony, no regalia.to summit. Felt like a cover, a way to pass the crown from father to uncle, without inviting further scrutiny. After all, if Dipendra was declared king and then declared dead, there would be no need for a deeper investigation, just a clean succession. And silence. In that silence, the legends began, not loudly, not immediately, but like all legends, they began in the gaps, the places where truth had gone missing. The most persistent of them claimed that Dipendra had survived. Not simply survived the self-inflicted gunshot, but had recovered and disappeared, spirited away by allies who believed in his innocence, or by forces more ancient, more secret. There was a word that surfaced again and again in such tales. Gufa, a Nepali word for cave. According to whispers, a secret passage had once connected the palace grounds to the nearby forested foothills. A tunnel used in times of war or exile. Old soldiers remembered it. Old monks hinted at it. One man, a retired guard from Bhaktapur, told a radio station anonymously. He was taken. That night, I saw men with torches, but not police, not military, older men. They came quietly. Then they were gone. No one verified it, but no one could disprove it either. A curious photograph surfaced in late 2002 to a blurred image of a man in the Mustang region of Nepal, far north, where the Himalayas meet Tibet. He wore sunglasses and a woolen scarf and was riding a horse through snow. The man looked strikingly like Dipendra Daiti was never confirmed. The photographer, a French trekker, said only. He nodded to me. There was something regal about him. I only learned later who he resembled. The photo was published in a Kathmandu tabloid that it caused a ripple, and then a hush. The palace refused comment. But beneath those frozen peaks, the story only grew. Monks in Mustang and Dalpo spoke of a silent guest who had once stayed in a monastery during a great national tragedy. He did not speak, but he prayed, and he wept. They would not name him. They only said he had the eyes of a fallen king, and from that, a new name was born, carried in the mouths of shepherds, carved into the wooden beams of mountain homes. The Prince of the Hollow Mountain. They said he lived still, that the mountain had taken him in, that it had sealed itself around him, as it had done for sages and warriors in ages past, and that he waited, not for revenge, but for release. Meanwhile, in Kathmandu, the royal family never recovered. King Gyanendra, Dipendra's uncle, took the throne in full after Dipendra's death, but his rule was not blessed. Protests began within months. His decisions felt distant. The monarchy lost its mystique. And soon, the people turned up. By 2006, the royal family was in crisis. And in 2008, it was abolished altogether. That a republic was declared. The palace gates opened. The crown, long considered sacred, was placed behind museum glass, and the throne of Nepal, once claimed by gods and warriors, was emptied. Yet even as the monarchy ended, the myth of Dipendra only deepened. Some say he was cursed. Others, protected. That a few believe he chose exile, an ascetic life in the highlands, atoning for sins he did not commit. They say he now walks alone, through mist and snow, occasionally glimpsed by travelers who lose their way. One mountaineer, caught in a blizzard near Dalagiri, swore he saw a figure in white descend from the cliffs, wordless and barefoot. The figure led him to shelter, then vanished. When asked later what the man looked like, the climber replied, like someone who once wore a crown. and forgot it. Of course, many dismiss these tales, too romantic, too strange, too convenient. The truth, they say, lies in that sealed report, in the bullet wounds, in the silence of a palace afraid of its own secrets. But even they admit something about the story refuses to settle. Something doesn't fit. Perhaps it's the way the massacre ended. Too clean, too fast, or the way the nation was asked to forget and move on, or perhaps it's simply that the mind recoils from the thought that one man, with such history behind him, could vanish so completely, leaving behind no justice, no confession, no real ending. Only rumors, only fog. The hollow mountain, as it's spoken of in hushed tones, is not marked on any map that IT does not have coordinates. But it exists, not in the way cities or rivers exist, but in the way secrets. Do.it is the space where memory retreats when truth becomes too painful, the mountain where lost things go, and where kings may still walk. Unseen, there is something peculiar about vanished kings. They do not leave behind empty thrones. They leave behind a hum, not quite a sound, not quite a silence. A murmur just beneath reality, like wind passing through a half-open temple. In Nepal, this murmur persisted. Long after the rituals were done, long after the flowers had withered on the royal funeral pyres, it lingered in the minds of the people. Because in truth, no one had seen Dipendra die. The official story went like this. Crown Prince Dipendra, after allegedly gunning down nearly a dozen of his own family members in a drunken rage, had turned the gun on himself. A single shot to the head. He was found slumped near a garden fountain, breathing but unresponsive. He was rushed to the military hospital, declared brain dead. Yet, in the 3 days that followed, he was named king, while still comatose. Then, without ever regaining consciousness, he died, and the story ended. Neat, contained, clean. Except it wasn't. A few kilometers from the palace, a former royal physician sat in quiet retirement. He had served 3 generations of monarchs, delivered babies, attended coronations, tended to bruises and fevers. On the night of the massacre, he was called, urgently, to the palace, but he was turned away at the gates. We have enough medical staff. The guards had said he never saw the prince, never signed a certificate. Years later, he confided to a friend. They didn't need a doctor that night. They needed a witness to stay away. The friend asked him what he meant. He only shrugged. Sometimes, the truth is a guest that never arrives. A nurse at the hospital, stationed at the ICU where Dipendra was kept, told a different story. She said the prince opened his eyes, just once, and whispered a name. But she would never say what that name was. Her contract was terminated a week later. Her family emigrated quietly. Dipendra had always been an enigma. Tall, athletic, highly educated. He studied in England and returned with polished manners. In foreign books, he spoke Sanskrit as easily as English. He practiced martial arts. He wrote poetry. He collected antique weapons. He was admired and feared. But beneath the surface, there was unease. His romance with Devyani Rana, a noblewoman from a rival political family, was known but never approved. Rumors swirled of confrontations with his parents. There were whispers of surveillance, isolation, heavy drinking, even psychological torment. Yet still, those who knew him could not reconcile the bloodbath with the man they remembered. He had a temper, one former classmate said. But murder? That wasn't him. And so, theories bloomed. Was he drugged? Set up? A scapegoat for a coup? Did he fire the gun? Or did someone else, wearing his face in shadow? And if he didn't die, who helped him vanish? A journalist named Lakshmi Thapa, driven half-mad by the inconsistencies in the official story, spent years piecing together fragments. He visited every corner of Nepal, from the Terai Plains to the Himalayan passes, following rumors that a yak herder in Dalpa told him of a traveler with royal eyes, that a reclusive monk in the Langtang Valley gave him an old scroll, no words, just an ink drawing of a man wearing a tilted crown and standing before a cave. Lakshmi returned to Kathmandu with pages of notes he was preparing to publish. Then, one cold night, he disappeared. His apartment was undisturbed, his typewriter still warm. The only thing missing was his manuscript. In the capital, the people whispered not in fear, but with a strange kind of reverence. Dipendra had not been loved in life, but in myth, he was reborn. Some called him a fallen bodhisattva, walking the path of suffering to redeem his nation. Others believed he had gone deep into the Himalayas, to the hidden land of Shambhala, a kingdom spoken of in Tibetan lore, where the final battle between wisdom and ignorance would one day unfold. That in such stories, Dipendra became more than a man. Asterisk, he became a question. One such tale told of a temple north of Pokhara, carved into stone, where a man in white robes would arrive each winter. He never spoke. He never prayed aloud. But he lit one candle and left. The temple keeper, a blind man, said the visitors smelled of jasmine and metal, a scent like old swords and palace gardens. He said that he once dared to ask the visitor his name. The man paused, then whispered, "I am the son of fire and silence." The government denied all rumors. That a spokesman dismissed the claims with an exhausted sigh. Nepal has had enough of ghosts. Let the dead rest. But not all were content to forget. Point one group, a loose collective of historians, ex-soldiers, and exile monks, formed a secret archive. Hidden in a valley east of Bhaktapur, they collected forbidden fragments, torn pages, unedited reports, abandoned audio recordings. They called themselves Shesh Itihas, the remaining history. Their guiding belief was simple, that history, when suppressed, does not die. It waits. Point one day, the world would be ready, and the prince would return. A strange footnote emerged in 2013. Asterisk, a Nepalese climber, hired as a guide for a European expedition on the Kanchenjunga range, claimed that his party was stopped at a remote monastery, not on any map, not listed in any official record. Inside, they met an elder, white hair, steady eyes, a voice like carved stone. The man spoke Sanskrit and perfect British English. When the climber asked him how he came to be there, the elder smiled and said, "Once, I held a kingdom in my palm. Now I hold only snow." They stayed the night. In the morning, the monastery was gone. The climber later tried to find the place again, but he never did. There is a phrase in Nepali folklore, Jaha Gufa, Tayaha Rahasya. Where there is a cave, there is a secret. The Hollow Mountain is not a place on a map. That it is a state of exile, a spiritual geography, a place where the fallen go, not to die, but to be forgotten. Properly, Dipendra, some say, did not die a king, nor a murderer. He became something stranger, that a shadow inside a myth, that a name left off the list. And perhaps that was the greatest punishment, or salvation. In Kathmandu, the palace is now a museum. Tourists walk its marbled halls, peering at bullet-riddled curtains and throne rooms preserved in quiet glass. School children sketch the crown. Guards smile politely. But somewhere deep in its walls, a corridor remains closed, unrenovated, untouched. That it leads to a room no one speaks of, and on its locked door, in faded paint, is a single word, Raja. King. It is said in Kathmandu that when the wind comes down from the north, it carries the voices of the lost, not screams, not weeping. Only a name, spoken as though by water slipping over stone. Dipindra. Always, it is Dipindra, the king who ruled. Without waking. The prince who died in silence. The man who may yet be watching. But not all myths survive as whispers. Some crawl into the official record like vines into a ruin. And one of them began with a banquet in 2007, for years after Nepal abolished its monarchy. A mid-level banker working for a Swiss-affiliated firm filed an unusual report. A client, registered under a false name, had accessed a dormant account. The account had lain untouched for nearly a decade. Its origin, a confidential royal trust from Kathmandu, initiated just months before the 2001 massacre, the banker noted. Two things. First, the biometric verification used to access the account didn't match anyone on public record. Second, the man who came to the Zurich office wore gloves and walked with a cane that he spoke only once, in perfect Nepali. What is given by blood must be kept from dust. Then he vanished. The bank dismissed the report. The banker was offered a promotion in Singapore that he declined. Retired early. Moved to the hills of Uttarakhand and never spoke publicly again. Meanwhile, back in Nepal, the royal family's legacy unraveled. Palace assets were seized, statues removed, the crown itself, glimmering with rubies and the ancient diamond called Ramji Ranjit, was displayed in a bulletproof case at the museum. Tourists snapped photos. Children laughed. The monarchy was over, but not forgotten. There were those who still laid marigolds at the palace gate, those who lit candles near the garden where the prince had fallen, and occasionally, on stormy nights, someone would scratch a name onto the brass of the closed royal chapel door. Always the same name. Not Birendra, not Gyanendra, but Dipindra. In 2015, the great earthquake came. Temples fell. Walls cracked. The city reeled. And during the reconstruction, a set of sealed tunnels beneath the palace gardens was accidentally opened. They had been marked on no blueprints. Inside, workers found ancient stone carvings, broken weapons, and, strangely, a leather-bound journal with the crest of the royal guard. Most pages were rotted, but one passage remained legible. He walks between the shrines. His mind is fogged, but his face is unchanged. The moon sees him clearly, even if we cannot. We are told to speak of him as if he were ash. But he is still flame. No name, no date. The journal was quietly removed, its contents never officially catalogued. There is a photograph. Unverified, poorly lit, circulated only in the margins of the internet. It shows a man, older now, seated cross-legged in front of a fire. On a mountain ledge. He wears simple robes. His hair is short. His eyes, barely visible, are piercing that a faint scar can be seen along his temple, just above the left eye. The photographer's name is unknown, but the caption reads, "The mountain keeps what the kingdom cast away." Experts dismissed it as a hoax, yet it has never been conclusively disproven. And the mountain in the background? Identified. Kanchenjunga's western face, that a place where no road reaches. Only silence. And snowed. But perhaps the most unsettling piece of the puzzle came not from whispers, but from song. In the village of Kulakani, a new ballad began to surface. Sung by children. No one knew where it started. The melody was old, but the words were not. They spoke of a prince with silver eyes who walked through fire but did not burn. Of a crown made of ghosts. Of a garden soaked in sorrow. The song ended with a line repeated 3 times. The king sleeps where the mountain weeps. The king sleeps where the mountain weeps. The king watches from the hollow. It would be easy to dismiss all of this. A nation, traumatized by bloodshed, trying to make sense of senseless loss out of people clinging to a more noble version of events. And yet, why, after so many years, does Dipendra's story resist stillness? Why do monks speak of him in riddles? Why do villagers light lamps for him on festival nights? Why does no one speak his name inside the palace museum? Why was his body cremated in complete secrecy, without public viewing? And why, oh why did the royal crest on his urn appear scratched out? There is one final tale that it comes from a foreign journalist, an old war correspondent named Brenton Vale, who visited Nepal in the early 2000s. While trekking near Mustang, he was caught in a blizzard and rescued by a group of local shepherds. They took him to a cave for shelter. Inside, by the fire, he met a man, silent, regal, calm. They did not speak much, but the man offered him food and wrapped his bleeding hand with surprising skill. When Vale asked for his name, the man only said, "I was once called Future. Now I am past." The next morning, Vale woke up alone. The cave was empty, but on the stone where he had slept, someone had carved a single word with a knife: Dipendra. Vale returned to London and never reported the story, but in an interview years later, shortly before his death, he said, "I've met kings and killers. I've seen lies dressed as truth and truths buried like bones. But that man had the weight of 10 crowns in his silence. If he was not Dipendra, then I've never met royalty at all." In the end, what do we know? That bullets flew in a garden once thought sacred, that a dynasty died under starlight, that a crown passed to a ghost, and then to silence, that Dipendra Bikram Shah Dev ruled as king while unconscious, that he died unseen, and that even now, his name carries weight no tombstone can hold. In the hush of the high mountains, when the air grows thin and dreams come close, some still say he walks, not as a king, not as a prince, but as something stranger. A secret unburied, a fire unquenched, a name unsaid, the prince of the hollow mountain. You've now heard them, 8 rulers swallowed by time. Some disappeared amid chaos and fire. Others faded more slowly, like breath upon a mirror. But all of them slipped through the cracks of history. Their names are carved in chronicles. But the endings are always missing, like torn pages from a book you were never allowed to finish. Was Edward V smothered in the tower, or spirited away beneath a false name? Did Nadir Shah perish in a distant desert, or did his treasures bury him? What became of Constantine, last emperor of Byzantium, whose body was never found, whose memory burns like a torch behind ancient walls? Perhaps you felt the silence around James IV of Scotland, whose crown dissolved into myth, or the stillness that settled over Blanche of Bourbon's shuttered chamber. Some say Sultan al-Ashraf walked into a sandstorm that led him to another world. Some say Ranavalona III never left Paris at all. And Crown Prince Dipendra? Did he die? Or did he wake and disappear behind a second curtain? We do not claim to know the answers. We only offer the questions and the silence that followed them. History is not always a finished story. Often, it is a trail that fades just before the final step. And so we leave you now, in the company of whispers and half-remembered rains. We hope their echoes linger with you, softly, as you drift into sleep or thought, or both. And if you find yourself wondering what other names were lost, what other rulers vanished without farewell, you're not alone. This is only one chamber of mystery. There are many more to open. Thank you for wandering with us tonight. Until next time, for Mysteries Unfold Official, sleep softly and dream of forgotten kings.